Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Earl Thompson, and I've been running freight across this great country for 22 years. Started when I was 24, fresh out of the Army after serving 2 tours in Iraq as a logistics specialist, and figured driving truck would be a good way to see America while making decent money. Over 2 decades, I've hauled everything from auto parts to fresh produce, logged over 3.2 million safe miles, and thought I'd seen every weird thing the road could throw at me. I was wrong. This happened in late October 2023, and I still wake up some nights wondering if what I experienced was real or if the isolation of night driving finally got to me. But the evidence suggests it was real. Too real. The FBI case file sitting in my glove compartment reminds me every day that sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones you expect to meet in dark alleys. They're the ones wearing business suits and carrying clipboards, speaking your language and knowing exactly which buttons to push to make an experienced driver ignore his instincts. I was running for Schneider National at the time, had been with them for 8 years after spending the previous 14 bouncing between smaller outfits trying to find the right fit. Schneider treated their drivers right. Good equipment, fair dispatch, steady miles that kept food on the table, and my mortgage paid, plus decent health benefits that mattered more as I got older. My regular rig was a 2020 Freightliner Cascadia with a 72-inch sleeper berth, Detroit DD15 engine pushing 505 horsepower, and about 340,000 miles on the odometer. She wasn't the prettiest truck on the road, painted in Schneider's standard orange and white livery, but she was reliable, comfortable, and I'd grown attached to her quirks over the years. The truck had been spec'd for long-haul work with all the amenities that make life on the road bearable: APU for climate control during rest periods, premium sound system, ergonomic seat that could handle 11-hour driving days, and enough storage space in the sleeper for personal items and a small refrigerator. The Detroit engine was paired with a DT12 automated transmission that took some getting used to after years of driving stick, but it delivered excellent fuel economy and reduced driver fatigue on long pulls through mountain grades. Most importantly, the truck was equipped with all the latest safety technology: collision mitigation system, lane departure warnings, electronic stability control, and a comprehensive fleet management system that monitored everything from engine performance to driver behavior. Schneider took safety seriously, and they equipped their trucks accordingly. In 8 years driving for them, I'd never had a preventable accident or a serious mechanical failure. The load that changed everything started innocently enough. I got the dispatch on a Tuesday evening while I was finishing up my mandatory 10-hour break at a Flying J in Amarillo, Texas. I'd been running a dedicated route between distribution centers in Texas and California for the past 6 months. Steady work that kept me moving and brought me home to Oklahoma City every couple weeks to see my daughter Sarah and her 2 kids. The paperwork showed a pickup at Meridian Industrial Solutions in Little Rock, Arkansas, with delivery to Pacific Northwest Logistics in Portland, Oregon. Sealed trailer, high-value electronics, standard security protocols that I'd handled dozens of times before. The commodity was listed as consumer electronics, smartphones, tablets, gaming devices, worth approximately $2.8 million, according to the declared value on the bill of lading. The rate was good, not exceptional, but solid enough to keep me interested at $3,100 for the round trip. What caught my attention was the pickup time, 11:30 p.m. on Wednesday night. Most legitimate shippers operate during normal business hours, but electronics companies sometimes run night shifts to meet production schedules or accommodate special shipping requirements, so it wasn't unprecedented. I'd picked up from Apple facilities in California at midnight, loaded Samsung shipments at 2 a.m., and hauled Microsoft products during overnight shifts when they were launching new products. The delivery appointment in Portland was set for Friday morning between 8 and 10 a.m., giving me about 36 hours to cover roughly 1,600 miles. Tight but doable if I managed my 14-hour driving clock carefully and didn't hit weather delays or construction zones. The route would take me north through Oklahoma and Kansas, then west across Colorado and Utah before turning northwest through Idaho to Oregon. Familiar territory that I'd covered hundreds of times over the years. I called my dispatcher, Maria Santos, to confirm the load details and discuss any special requirements. Maria had been my primary dispatcher for 3 years, and we'd developed a good working relationship based on mutual respect and clear communication. "Earl, glad you can take this one," she said when I reached her. "High-value load, so company wants extra security precautions. No unnecessary stops, maintain communication every 4 hours, and call immediately if anything unusual happens." "Roger that, Maria. Any special delivery requirements in Portland?" "Standard dock delivery. Pacific Northwest Logistics handles a lot of high-end electronics, so they know the drill. Just make sure your seals are intact when you arrive." Maria also provided me with emergency contact numbers for both the shipper and consignee, plus a Schneider security hotline that was monitored 24/7 for high-value loads. Everything seemed routine and professional. I rolled out of Amarillo around 6 a.m. Wednesday morning, giving myself plenty of time to reach Little Rock with hours to spare. The drive across Texas and into Arkansas was routine. Light traffic, clear weather, and my Freightliner eating up the miles at a steady 65 mph. I stopped for fuel at a Pilot in Dallas, where I chatted with other Schneider drivers about road conditions and compared notes on routes and fuel prices. At the Pilot, I ran into Jake Morrison, a veteran driver who'd been with Schneider for 15 years and knew every trick for maximizing efficiency and avoiding problems. Jake was heading west with a load of automotive parts, and we shared coffee while our trucks were being fueled. "You running that electronics load to Portland?" he asked, having heard about it through the driver network. "Yeah, picking up tonight in Little Rock. You know anything about Meridian Industrial?" Jake shook his head. "Never heard of them, but that doesn't mean much. New companies pop up all the time in electronics distribution. Just make sure your paperwork's in order and watch your back with high-value loads like that." It was good advice from an experienced driver, and I filed it away as I continued east toward Arkansas. I grabbed a quick shower and meal at a TA near Shreveport, then pushed on toward Little Rock, arriving in the area by 9 p.m. with time to spare. The extra time gave me an opportunity to scout the pickup location and familiarize myself with the area. Meridian Industrial Solutions was located in an industrial park on the south side of Little Rock, off Interstate 440 near the airport. The area was typical for that type of facility. Warehouses, distribution centers, and manufacturing plants spread across several square miles of formerly rural land that had been developed over the past couple decades as Little Rock's economy diversified beyond government and agriculture. I drove through the industrial park to get a feel for the layout and traffic patterns. Most of the buildings were modern, utilitarian structures designed for efficiency rather than aesthetics. The roads were well maintained, with adequate turning radius for trucks and proper signage. Several other trucking companies were operating in the area, suggesting it was a legitimate freight hub. The Meridian facility itself was a large single-story building with multiple loading docks and a decent-sized parking area for trucks. Security lighting illuminated the property, and I could see several other trucks staged around the lot, suggesting this was a legitimate operation with regular freight volume. A chain-link fence with razor wire topped the perimeter, and a guard shack controlled access to the main gate. Everything looked professional and properly secured. I parked at a nearby truck stop to grab dinner and wait for my appointment time. The facility was a small independent operation called Razorback Travel Center. Clean, friendly, and popular with local drivers who knew the area. The restaurant served decent food at reasonable prices, and the staff was knowledgeable about local traffic patterns and shipping operations. While eating dinner, I struck up a conversation with a local driver named Bobby Patterson, who'd been running freight in and out of Little Rock for 12 years. Bobby knew most of the major shippers and receivers in the area, and was happy to share information with an out-of-state driver. "Meridian Industrial?" he said when I mentioned my pickup. "Can't say I know them personally, but I've seen their trucks around. Seem to run a lot of night operations. Electronics companies like to ship when there's less traffic on the roads." Bobby also warned me about construction on I-40 west of Little Rock that could delay my departure if I wasn't careful about timing. "They've got a lane restriction about 30 miles out that backs up traffic during shift changes. Try to clear the area before 6 a.m. or after 9 a.m. to avoid the worst of it." This kind of local knowledge was invaluable for maintaining schedule efficiency, and I made a note to factor the construction into my departure planning. At 11:20 p.m., I pulled up to the guard shack at Meridian Industrial Solutions, 10 minutes early, as was my habit. Punctuality was a matter of professional pride, and I'd learned over the years that arriving slightly early demonstrated reliability while avoiding the complications that came with being late. The security guard was a middle-aged black man wearing a standard uniform shirt and carrying a clipboard. He looked professional enough, though something about his demeanor seemed off. Not unfriendly exactly, but distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. Most facility guards I'd encountered over the years were either chatty types who enjoyed talking with drivers, or strictly business types who processed paperwork efficiently and sent you on your way. This guard fell into neither category. "Earl Thompson with Schneider," I said, handing him my driver's license and the pickup paperwork. "Got an 11:30 appointment." He examined my documents more thoroughly than usual, checking something on his clipboard multiple times and comparing information that should have been straightforward. Most guards simply verify that the driver name matches the appointment list and wave trucks through. This guard was taking extra time and seemed to be consulting additional documentation. "First time picking up here?" he asked, still studying my paperwork. "Yes, sir. Usually run the West Coast routes, but they needed someone to cover this load." He nodded slowly, made a note on his clipboard, then handed everything back without making direct eye contact. "Dock 7, he said, pointing toward the building. "Follow the arrows to the back dock area. They're expecting you." I thanked him and drove through the gate, following a series of painted arrows on the asphalt toward the rear of the building. The loading dock area was well lit and professionally laid out with 10 numbered bays. Dock 7 was near the center, with a single trailer already backed up to the adjacent dock. As I maneuvered my rig into position, I noticed that despite the late hour, there was a fair amount of activity around the facility. Forklifts were moving freight between the docks and the warehouse. Workers in safety vests were directing traffic, and supervisors with clipboards were coordinating operations. The level of activity seemed consistent with a legitimate night shift operation, though I noticed that many of the workers appeared to be temporary or contract personnel rather than full-time employees. Their movements were competent, but lacked the efficiency that comes from years of experience in the same facility. I backed up to Dock 7, set my brakes, and completed the standard arrival procedures. I checked my electronic logging device to record the arrival time, verified that my fuel levels were adequate for the trip to Portland, and performed a quick systems check to ensure my truck was ready for immediate departure once loading was complete. As I climbed down from my cab to meet the shipping personnel, I encountered my first real red flag. Instead of the clipboard-carrying dock supervisor I expected, I was met by a woman in her mid-30s wearing business attire. Dress slacks, blazer, and heels that seemed impractical for a loading dock environment. "Mr. Thompson?" she asked, extending her hand with a professional smile. "I'm Sarah Martinez, logistics coordinator. Thank you for being punctual." Her handshake was firm and confident, but something about the whole interaction felt rehearsed. Most dock supervisors are working folks who've spent years in warehouses and distribution centers. They wear steel-toed boots, safety vests, hard hats, and have calloused hands from handling freight. They speak the language of logistics, weights, dimensions, handling requirements, and delivery schedules. Sarah looked like she belonged in a corporate office, not on a loading dock at midnight. Her hands were soft, her clothing was expensive, and her manner of speaking was too polished for someone who worked in freight operations. She reminded me more of the sales representatives and account managers I'd met at industry conferences than the operational personnel who actually moved freight. "No problem," I replied, trying to assess the situation. "What are we loading tonight?" "High-end electronics," she said, consulting a tablet computer that looked more suited to executive presentations than warehouse operations. "Consumer devices destined for retail distribution on the West Coast. Total weight is approximately 42,000 pounds, well within your weight limits." She handed me a bill of lading that looked legitimate enough at first glance. Proper letterhead, sequential numbering, all the required information fields completed in what appeared to be standard format. But as I examined it more closely under my truck's dome light, I noticed some inconsistencies that bothered me. The commodity description was vague. Electronic devices rather than specific product categories like smartphones, tablets, or gaming consoles. Most electronics shippers provide detailed descriptions for customs and insurance purposes. The shipper and consignee information was complete, but didn't include the detailed contact information I usually saw on high-value loads. No after-hours phone numbers, emergency contacts, or special handling instructions. Most concerning, the declared value was listed as $2.8 million, which seemed high for a single trailer load of consumer electronics. I'd hauled plenty of high-value electronics over the years, and while expensive loads weren't uncommon, they usually came with additional documentation, security protocols, and chain of custody procedures that I wasn't seeing here. "This is quite a valuable load," I observed, looking for Sarah's reaction. "What kind of security protocols are we following?" Sarah's smile never wavered, but I detected a brief hesitation before she responded. "Standard procedures for high-value freight, sealed trailer, direct routing, no unnecessary stops. The consignee will have security personnel on site for delivery." Her answer was technically correct, but lacked the specificity I expected for a load worth nearly $3 million. Most high-value shipments came with detailed security briefings, escort requirements, communication protocols, and specific route restrictions. Schneider's policy for loads over $2 million included additional driver screening, mandatory check-ins every 2 hours, and coordination with law enforcement in certain areas. While we talked, I watched the loading process through the open dock door. The freight appeared to be legitimate. Palletized boxes bearing recognizable electronics brand logos like Apple, Samsung, and Sony. The packaging looked authentic, with proper shrink wrapping, tamper-evident seals, and standard warehouse handling procedures. The dock workers were using electric forklifts to position pallets in my trailer, and everything looked professional and above board. But there was something about the workers themselves that nagged at me. Most warehouse personnel develop a rhythm over years of loading trucks. They know how to position freight for optimal weight distribution, how to secure loads to prevent shifting during transport, and how to maximize trailer utilization while maintaining accessibility for partial unloads. These workers were competent enough, but they moved like people who weren't entirely familiar with the process. Small hesitations when positioning pallets, slight inefficiencies in their movement patterns, and occasional conferences with supervisors about procedures that should have been automatic. It was the kind of behavior I'd expect from temporary workers or new employees, not the experienced crew you'd typically find handling high-value electronics. I also noticed that the facility's operations seemed unusually compartmentalized. The workers loading my trailer weren't interacting with personnel at other docks, and there was very little of the casual conversation and coordination you'd normally see in a busy warehouse. Each team seemed focused solely on their assigned task. which created an atmosphere that felt more like a carefully orchestrated event than routine business operations. The loading process took about 45 minutes, which was reasonable for a full trailer. The workers positioned the freight carefully, secured everything with load bars and strapping, and documented the process with photographs and paperwork. When they finished, Sarah presented me with the sealed bill of lading and trailer security documents. The seals were numbered and recorded properly, and the paperwork appeared to be in order. Sarah provided me with custody transfer documents, photographed the seal installation process, and had me sign multiple copies of various forms. The level of documentation was consistent with high-value freight procedures, though some of the forms looked slightly different from those I'd encountered with other electronics shippers. "The consignee will be expecting you Friday morning between 8 and 10 a.m., she said, handing me a business card with contact information. "Pacific Northwest Logistics on Swan Island in Portland. Do you have any questions about the delivery requirements?" I reviewed the delivery address and contact information. Pacific Northwest Logistics was a name I recognized, a legitimate freight forwarder that handled imported electronics and other consumer goods. The address on Swan Island was in the right area for that type of operation, in an industrial district near the port of Portland where many logistics companies maintained facilities. "Looks straightforward," I said. "I'll plan to arrive around 9 a.m. Friday." Sarah nodded and wished me safe travels. But as I was preparing to leave, I noticed something that gave me pause. She was walking toward the administrative office area, but instead of entering the main building, she got into a car parked in the visitor lot and drove away. In 22 years of trucking, I'd never seen a logistics coordinator leave the facility immediately after dispatching a high-value load. Most companies require management personnel to remain on site until the truck clears the property and all security protocols are complete. They need to be available to handle last-minute issues, coordinate with security personnel, and ensure that proper documentation has been transmitted to the consignee. I filed that observation away and focused on getting back on the road. My delivery schedule required me to drive through the night to stay on track, and I needed to manage my 14-hour driving clock carefully to avoid violations. Electronic logging devices don't forgive scheduling mistakes, and a violation would trigger intervention from Schneider's safety department. I completed my pre-trip inspection, verified that my load was properly secured, and checked all my truck's systems one more time. The trailer seals were intact and properly recorded. My fuel levels were adequate for the first leg of the journey, and all my gauges showed normal readings. I pulled away from Dock 7, followed the arrows back to the main gate, and nodded to the security guard as I exited the facility. He raised his hand in acknowledgement, but again avoided eye contact. By midnight, I was westbound on Interstate 40, settling into the rhythm of night driving that had become second nature over 2 decades on the road. The highway was relatively quiet. Scattered cars, a few other trucks, and the occasional emergency vehicle. My Freightliner was running smoothly. The load was tracking properly with no unusual vibrations or handling issues, and all my gauges showed normal readings. Under ordinary circumstances, this would have been the kind of peaceful night drive that reminded me why I loved trucking. The freedom of the open road, the satisfaction of moving valuable freight safely and efficiently, and the quiet contemplation that comes with hours of uninterrupted driving through sleeping towns and empty countryside. But something felt wrong from the moment I left Little Rock. Nothing I could put my finger on initially, just a nagging sense that the pickup hadn't been as routine as it appeared. The more I thought about it, the more the small inconsistencies bothered me. Sarah's inappropriate attire for a loading dock environment, the workers who seemed unfamiliar with standard procedures, the logistics coordinator leaving immediately after dispatch. Individually, these details might be explained by circumstances I wasn't aware of, a new manager trying to make an impression, temporary workers covering for vacations, or personnel schedules I didn't understand. But collectively, they suggested something wasn't quite right. Around 1 a.m., while passing through Russellville, Arkansas, I decided to do some research. I pulled into a well-lit truck stop called the Ozark Travel Plaza, parked near the main building where there was good visibility and foot traffic, and used my smartphone to look up Meridian Industrial Solutions. Their website appeared professional enough at first glance, with standard corporate messaging about logistics services, customer satisfaction, and reliable freight solutions. The design was modern and functional, with photographs of warehouse operations and testimonials from satisfied customers. But when I tried to find independent verification of their legitimacy, I came up empty. No Better Business Bureau listings, no industry trade publication mentions, no employee reviews on job sites like Glassdoor or Indeed. For a company operating a facility large enough to handle multiple truckloads per night, the lack of online presence was unusual. Most legitimate logistics companies had years of accumulated web presence, news articles about expansions, industry association memberships, and the digital footprints that came from participating in commerce. I also tried calling the delivery contact number listed on my bill of lading. It was after 1 a.m., so I didn't expect anyone to answer, but I wanted to hear the voicemail message to verify it was legitimate. Instead of a professional greeting identifying Pacific Northwest Logistics, I got a generic voicemail recording with no company identification. That was definitely not normal for a business expecting a $2.8 million freight delivery. Legitimate logistics companies maintained 24-hour contact capabilities for their high-value shipments, with emergency numbers that connected to duty managers, security personnel, or answering services that could handle urgent issues. My unease was growing, but I was also aware that jumping to conclusions could be dangerous. Companies changed their procedures. Personnel worked unusual schedules, and legitimate explanations often existed for things that seemed suspicious at first glance. I'd learned over the years that paranoia could be just as harmful as negligence when it came to freight operations. I decided to continue with the delivery while remaining alert for additional red flags. I grabbed a coffee and a sandwich from the truck stop, used the facilities, and checked my load securement one more time. The trailer seals were intact. The freight hadn't shifted during the first hour of driving, and my weight distribution felt normal. Whatever was in those boxes, it was properly loaded and secured. I also used the stop to call my dispatcher and report my progress. Maria Santos answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. "Earl, how did the pickup go?" "Smooth enough," I replied, not wanting to voice my concerns without more concrete evidence. "Load secure, and I'm making good time. Should be in Portland right on schedule Friday morning." "Good to hear. Remember to check in every 4 hours and call immediately if anything unusual happens." "Roger that, Maria. Any updates on road conditions ahead?" She provided me with current information about weather, construction, and traffic conditions for my route. Everything looked clear for the next several hours, with only minor delays expected around Denver due to ongoing highway improvements. I climbed back into my cab and resumed my westward journey, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I rolled through the Arkansas countryside, I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, monitoring my CB radio for unusual chatter, and paying closer attention to other vehicles on the highway than normal. The drive across Arkansas and into Oklahoma was uneventful. Light traffic, clear weather, and no mechanical issues. I made good time and reached Oklahoma City around 5 a.m., where I stopped for fuel and my mandatory 30-minute break. The sun was coming up, and the morning rush hour was beginning to build. Normal sights and sounds that helped ease some of my anxiety about the load. The fuel stop was a busy TA travel center that I'd used many times over the years. The facility was modern and well-maintained, with good security and plenty of activity even during early morning hours. I felt more comfortable there than I had at the smaller truck stop in Arkansas, surrounded by other drivers and normal trucking operations. But as I was completing my fuel purchase, something happened that reignited all my concerns. A man approached me at the fuel island, well-dressed, professional appearance, carrying what looked like a briefcase or laptop case. He appeared to be in his 40s, with short graying hair and the kind of confident demeanor that suggested management or executive experience. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you Earl Thompson with Schneider?" Immediately, every warning bell in my head started ringing. Random strangers don't approach truck drivers by name at fuel stops unless something unusual is happening. In 22 years of trucking, I could count on one hand the number of times someone had approached me like this, and each time it had been because of some kind of problem or emergency. The last time it happened, 3 years earlier in Nevada, it had been a state trooper investigating a hit-and-run accident where someone had reported seeing a truck matching my description. Before that, it had been a Schneider safety supervisor conducting a random audit of driver compliance. In both cases, the contact had been legitimate but unexpected. "Who's asking?" I replied, keeping my distance and positioning myself where I could reach my cab quickly if necessary. "My name is David Chen," he said, pulling out what appeared to be a business card. "I'm with Pacific Northwest Logistics in Portland. There's been a change in the delivery schedule, and I need to discuss some modifications to your routing." I accepted the business card but didn't look at it immediately. Instead, I focused on Chen's body language and demeanor. He seemed nervous, glancing around the truck stop as if looking for something or someone. His story about delivery changes also didn't make sense. Legitimate schedule modifications were handled through dispatch channels, not by having management personnel intercept drivers at random fuel stops. In my experience, logistics companies operated through established communication protocols. They contacted drivers through company dispatch, sent updates via electronic messaging systems, or used fleet management companies to coordinate changes. They didn't send executives to intercept trucks at fuel stops in Oklahoma City. "Any schedule changes need to go through my dispatcher," I said. "Company policy." Chen's expression shifted slightly, becoming more urgent. "I understand the normal procedures, but this is a time-sensitive situation. We've had some security concerns about the original delivery location, and we need to redirect the load to an alternate facility." Now I was certain something was wrong. Security concerns about delivery locations weren't handled by intercepting drivers on the highway. They were managed through proper channels with documentation, authorization codes, verification procedures, and coordination with company security departments. Chen was either lying about his identity or involved in something that had nothing to do with legitimate freight delivery. "I'm going to need to verify this with my dispatch," I said, pulling out my phone. "What's your employee ID number and the authorization code for the routing change?" Chen hesitated for just a moment too long before responding. In legitimate business situations, employees can immediately provide their identification and authorization codes. The hesitation suggested he was either making up information or wasn't who he claimed to be. "Look, Mr. Thompson, I don't think you understand the urgency of the situation. We have reason to believe that your current load may be targeted for theft. For your own safety, you need to follow me to the alternate delivery location." That was the moment I knew for certain that Chen wasn't who he claimed to be. Legitimate logistics companies don't send employees to intercept trucks at fuel stops with vague warnings about theft. They work through proper law enforcement and industry security channels. They contact company dispatch, file reports with appropriate authorities, and coordinate protective measures through established protocols. Chen's approach was consistent with someone trying to steal my load or redirect it for reasons that had nothing to do with the safety of the freight or my personal security. His urgent manner, his inability to provide proper credentials, and his insistence on immediate action were all red flags that experienced drivers learn to recognize. "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said firmly, beginning to back toward my truck. "If there are legitimate security concerns, you can have my dispatcher contact me through official channels." Chen's friendly demeanor disappeared entirely. "Mr. Thompson, I'm trying to help you here. If you continue with the original delivery, you could be putting yourself in serious danger." I was already walking back toward my cab, keeping Chen in my peripheral vision while preparing to defend myself if necessary. Then you can explain the danger to the police, I said, climbing into my truck and immediately locking the doors. Chen stood beside my fuel island for several seconds, apparently deciding on his next move. I started my engine and prepared to leave, but he was blocking my exit path. Finally, he stepped aside, but not before making a gesture towards someone I couldn't see in the direction of the truck stop building. As I pulled away from the fuel island, I noticed a dark sedan that had been parked near the truck stop restaurant suddenly started up and began following me toward the highway entrance. The timing was too coincidental to be accidental, and the sedan maintained a consistent distance behind my truck as I merged onto Interstate 40. I grabbed my CB radio and switched to Channel 19. Breaker 19, this is Schneider driver westbound on I-40 at the Flying J in Oklahoma City. Got a possible situation developing here. Anyone else monitoring this channel? The response was immediate. Go ahead, Schneider driver. This is Roadmaster in the blue Peterbilt. What's your situation? Just had someone approach me claiming to be from my consignee, wanting to redirect my load. Now I've got a car following me. Might be nothing, but it feels wrong. Copy that, Schneider. I'm about 2 miles behind you on I-40 westbound. What kind of car are we looking for? I described the sedan and its location relative to my truck. Roadmaster confirmed he could see both vehicles and would stay in the area in case I needed assistance. Having another professional driver aware of my situation made me feel more secure, but it didn't eliminate my concerns about what was happening. The sedan followed me for about 20 miles before exiting the highway at a location that didn't correspond to any obvious destination. I never saw Chen or his car again, but the encounter had confirmed my suspicions that something unusual was happening with this load. I immediately called my dispatcher to report the incident. Maria Santos listened carefully to my description of the encounter and assured me that she would investigate the legitimacy of Chen's claims. Earl, I need you to know that we haven't received any communications from Pacific Northwest Logistics about delivery changes or security concerns. If someone claiming to represent the consignee contacts you again, get their information but don't follow any instructions until we can verify their identity. This confirmation strengthened my suspicion that Chen had been attempting some kind of fraud or theft. Maria also provided me with additional security protocols for high-value loads, including specific procedures for verifying the identity of anyone claiming to represent the shipper or consignee. I continued west through Oklahoma and into Texas, maintaining regular contact with other drivers on the CB and staying alert for any additional signs of trouble. The landscape changed from the rolling hills of eastern Oklahoma to the flat plains of the Texas Panhandle, with wide open spaces that offered good visibility but few places to seek help if trouble developed. Around noon, I stopped for my mandatory 10-hour break at a truck stop in Amarillo, parking in a well-lit area near the main building where there was constant activity. The facility was a large pilot travel center with good security, plenty of other drivers, and 24-hour staffing that made me feel more secure than smaller, isolated stops. While I was settling into my sleeper berth, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway, thinking it might be dispatch with updated delivery information. Earl Thompson? The voice was male, professional sounding, but not familiar. Speaking. This is Detective Rodriguez with the Arkansas State Police Criminal Investigation Division. I need to ask you some questions about a pickup you made last night in Little Rock. My blood went cold. Police don't call truck drivers about routine freight deliveries unless something criminal has occurred. What kind of questions? The facility where you picked up your load, Meridian Industrial Solutions, was burglarized early this morning. Approximately $3 million worth of electronics were stolen from their warehouse, and we're trying to determine if there's any connection to freight that was shipped from that location recently. I sat up in my sleeper berth, my mind racing through the implications. If the facility had been burglarized after my pickup, it raised serious questions about the legitimacy of my load. Detective, I think you need to know that my pickup last night might not have been legitimate. I've had several things happen since then that suggest something wasn't right about the whole operation. Detective Rodriguez listened carefully as I described the inconsistencies I'd observed during the pickup, the encounter with Chen at the Oklahoma City truck stop, and my growing suspicions about the load I was carrying. When I finished, there was a long pause before he responded. "Mr. Thompson, I think you may have been unknowingly involved in the theft itself. The burglary at Meridian Industrial Solutions was sophisticated. Whoever did it had inside knowledge of the facility layout, security procedures, and inventory locations. But according to our investigation, no freight was actually shipped from that location last night. The real Meridian Industrial Solutions was closed for maintenance, and no legitimate pickups were scheduled." The implications hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't carrying electronics from a legitimate shipper to a legitimate consignee. I was carrying stolen goods, and I'd been set up as an unwitting accomplice in a multi-million-dollar theft operation. The fake facility, the professional-looking paperwork, the elaborate staging. It had all been designed to make me believe I was handling a routine freight shipment while actually transporting stolen merchandise. "Detective, what exactly are you telling me?" "We believe the thieves established a fake shipping facility in a warehouse they rented under false identities. They created fraudulent paperwork, hired temporary workers who thought they were participating in a legitimate midnight shift operation, and used the cover of a normal freight pickup to move stolen goods out of the area." The sophistication of the operation was staggering. The thieves had understood trucking procedures well enough to create a convincing fake shipping facility. They'd produced proper documentation, established legitimate-looking operations, and even created false identities for their personnel. The level of planning and resources required suggested this wasn't a simple smash-and-grab theft, but a complex criminal enterprise. "What do I do now?" I asked, already knowing the answer was going to complicate my life significantly. "We need you to stop immediately and secure your load until we can get investigators to your location. Don't open the trailer, don't let anyone else near your truck, and don't continue toward the delivery address under any circumstances. We're also coordinating with the FBI since this involves interstate transportation of stolen goods." I provided Detective Rodriguez with my exact location and agreed to wait for law enforcement to arrive. Within 2 hours, I was surrounded by FBI agents, Arkansas State Police investigators, and federal prosecutors who explained that my truck was now evidence in a major interstate theft case. The first FBI agent to arrive was Special Agent Sarah Chen, a woman in her early 40s with extensive experience in cargo theft investigations. She explained that the Bureau had been tracking sophisticated freight theft operations across multiple states, and my case appeared to be connected to a larger criminal network. "Mr. Thompson, you're not in any legal trouble at this point, but we need your complete cooperation to understand how this operation worked. The fact that you recognized something was wrong and reported suspicious activity actually makes you a valuable witness rather than a suspect." Agent Chen explained that the FBI had been investigating a series of sophisticated cargo thefts across the Southeast, all involving fake shipping facilities and elaborate staging operations designed to fool experienced drivers. My case was the first time they'd been able to intercept stolen goods before they disappeared into the criminal distribution network. The investigation that followed revealed the scope and sophistication of the operation. The thieves had established their fake shipping facility in a warehouse they'd rented under false identities, using forged corporate documents and stolen credit information to create the appearance of a legitimate business. They'd invested tens of thousands of dollars in equipment, signage, and personnel to make the operation convincing enough to fool experienced drivers. The stolen electronics in my trailer were worth approximately $2.8 million, exactly the amount listed on my bill of lading. The thieves had been sophisticated enough to use accurate values in their documentation, probably to avoid suspicion if anyone questioned the declared worth of the shipment. They'd also used genuine shipping forms and procedures that they'd somehow obtained from legitimate logistics companies. Agent Chen showed me photographs of the real Meridian Industrial Solutions facility, which was located on the opposite side of Little Rock from where I'd made my pickup. The legitimate company had been closed for scheduled maintenance the night of my pickup, and their security cameras had recorded the break-in that occurred while I was loading what I thought was legitimate freight. The thieves had inside knowledge of the real company's operations, Agent Chen explained. They knew about the maintenance closure, they had access to the facility layout and inventory locations, and they understood enough about the electronics industry to target specific high-value items. The fake Sarah Martinez who'd handled my pickup was identified as Rebecca Walsh, a former logistics company employee who'd been fired for embezzlement 2 years earlier. She'd used her industry knowledge to create convincing shipping procedures and had recruited temporary workers through employment agencies, telling them they were participating in a special overnight operation for a new client. David Chen, the man who'd approached me in Oklahoma City, was identified as Marcus Chen, no relation despite the shared last name, one of the ringleaders who'd been following my truck to monitor law enforcement activity and ensure the load reached its intended destination. The plan had been to intercept my truck before I reached the legitimate Pacific Northwest logistics facility in Portland, claiming to be authorized representatives who would handle the final delivery. Once they had possession of the trailer, they would disappear with the stolen goods, leaving you to explain to the real consignee why their freight never arrived, Agent Chen said. If you hadn't noticed the inconsistencies and reported your suspicions, you could have been left holding the bag for a multi-million-dollar theft. The most chilling aspect of the operation was how close I'd come to being framed as a willing participant. The fake paperwork was sophisticated enough to make it appear that I'd knowingly participated in the scheme, and proving my innocence would have been difficult and expensive. The thieves had deliberately chosen an out-of-state driver with no connections to the Little Rock area, making it easier to portray me as a hired accomplice if things went wrong. Agent Chen explained that this type of freight theft was becoming increasingly common as criminal organizations adapted to modern logistics systems. They're exploiting the complexity of supply chains and the trust that makes the trucking industry function. Drivers are trained to follow procedures and trust documentation, and these criminals understand how to manipulate that training. Over the following weeks, I provided detailed statements to federal investigators, testified before grand juries, and helped law enforcement understand every aspect of my experience. The FBI used my testimony to build cases against multiple defendants and to understand the methods used by the criminal network. The investigation revealed that this wasn't an isolated operation, but part of a larger criminal enterprise that had been operating across multiple states for over 2 years. The network included former trucking company employees, corrupt warehouse workers, identity theft specialists, and organized crime figures who specialized in moving stolen goods through legitimate commerce channels. The scope of the operation was staggering. Federal investigators eventually linked the network to more than $50 million in stolen freight, including electronics, pharmaceuticals, automotive parts, and consumer goods. They'd established fake shipping facilities in 6 different states, recruited dozens of unwitting drivers to transport stolen goods, and had developed sophisticated methods for creating fraudulent documentation. The criminal network had specifically targeted independent drivers and smaller trucking companies, believing they would be less likely to verify unusual pickup requirements or question suspicious circumstances. They'd studied the trucking industry extensively, learning standard procedures, communication protocols, and security measures so they could exploit them effectively. But what made the operation particularly insidious was their willingness to sacrifice innocent drivers to protect their criminal enterprise. Several drivers had been arrested and charged as accomplices before investigators realized they'd been deceived. Others had their careers destroyed by suspicion and investigation, even when no charges were filed. The personal cost to me was significant, even though I'd avoided criminal charges. My truck was impounded as evidence for 6 weeks, during which time I had no income and mounting bills. Schneider National was understanding about the circumstances, but my driving record now included an FBI investigation, which made some customers nervous about using my services. Insurance companies treated the incident as a security breach, which resulted in higher premiums for several years. Some shippers required additional background checks and security clearances before allowing me to handle their freight. The bureaucratic aftermath of being involved in a federal investigation lasted for months, with paperwork, depositions, and court appearances that disrupted my work schedule. More troubling was the psychological impact of realizing how easily I'd been manipulated. Despite 22 years of experience and a generally suspicious nature, I'd been drawn into a criminal operation by people who understood trucking well enough to exploit standard industry practices. The fake facility had been convincing enough to fool an experienced driver, and the documentation had been sophisticated enough to pass initial scrutiny. The experience forced me to question every aspect of how I approached freight handling. I started researching shippers and consignees before accepting loads, verifying contact information through independent sources, and maintaining detailed records of every interaction during pickup and delivery. I invested in additional security equipment for my truck and developed new procedures for handling unusual requests or circumstances. The trial process began 8 months after my initial pickup in Little Rock. Federal prosecutors had built cases against 17 defendants, including the fake Sarah Martinez, David Chen, and the mastermind behind the entire operation, a former trucking company executive named Robert Delano, who'd used his industry knowledge to identify vulnerabilities in freight security systems. During the trial, prosecutors revealed the full extent of the criminal network's operations. They'd recruited corrupt employees at legitimate trucking companies who provided inside information about high-value loads. They'd established relationships with organized crime figures who could move stolen goods through international markets. They'd even corrupted law enforcement personnel who provided advance warning of investigations. The fake facility where I'd made my pickup was just one of several operations the network maintained across the Southeast. They'd developed a sophisticated business model that allowed them to steal millions of dollars worth of freight while maintaining the appearance of legitimate commerce. Their success had attracted the attention of international criminal organizations interested in expanding into the American freight industry. Delano himself was a particularly troubling figure. He'd been a respected executive in the trucking industry for over 20 years, serving on industry committees and speaking at conferences about freight security. His inside knowledge of how the industry operated made him uniquely qualified to exploit its vulnerabilities. He'd used his legitimate business connections to gather intelligence about high-value shipments and had recruited former colleagues who provided ongoing access to shipping schedules and routes. The testimony revealed that my case had been specifically targeted because of the timing and value of the electronics shipment. The network had been monitoring shipping manifests from electronics manufacturers, looking for high-value loads that could be intercepted without triggering immediate investigation. They'd chosen my route because it crossed multiple state lines, which would complicate law enforcement coordination and provide more time to move stolen goods before anyone realized what had happened. The defense attorneys argued that their clients had been involved in a legitimate business operation and that any theft had been committed by unknown third parties. They claimed that the temporary workers at the fake facility had been deceived along with the drivers, and that the apparent criminal activity was actually a complex insurance fraud scheme designed to blame innocent people for corporate losses. But the prosecution had overwhelming evidence of criminal intent. Recorded phone conversations revealed detailed planning of the theft operation. Financial records showed payments to corrupt employees and equipment purchases for the fake facility. Surveillance footage captured the defendants coordinating the theft from the legitimate Meridian Industrial Solutions warehouse. Most damaging was evidence that the network had been planning to frame drivers like me if their operations were discovered. They'd developed contingency plans that would make unwitting drivers appear to be willing accomplices, including false documentation that suggested drivers had been paid for their participation in the scheme. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses including drivers, law enforcement officers, industry experts, and members of the criminal network who'd agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. I testified for 2 days about my experience, describing every detail of the pickup process and the subsequent investigation. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Delano received 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, interstate theft, and racketeering. The fake Sarah Martinez got 15 years. David Chen received 12 years. Other defendants received sentences ranging from 5 to 18 years, depending on their level of involvement. But the convictions didn't undo the damage to my career and reputation. Even with the criminal network exposed and convicted, some customers remained nervous about working with drivers who'd been involved in major theft cases. My insurance premiums remained elevated for years, and I had to undergo additional background checks and security clearances for certain types of freight. The experience also changed how I approached every aspect of trucking. I became much more selective about the loads I accepted, focusing on shippers and consignees I could verify through multiple sources. I developed new procedures for documenting pickup and delivery processes, including photographs and detailed notes about personnel and facilities. Most importantly, I learned that criminals were constantly adapting their methods to exploit new vulnerabilities in the freight industry. The same technology and procedures that made modern logistics efficient also created opportunities for sophisticated criminal enterprises. Electronic documentation, streamlined pickup procedures, and reduced human verification made it easier for criminals to insert fraudulent shipments into legitimate freight networks. The FBI used my case to develop new training materials for drivers and dispatchers, highlighting the warning signs of fraudulent shipping operations. Several industry associations incorporated elements of my experience into their security awareness programs. My story became a cautionary tale about the evolving nature of freight crime and the importance of maintaining vigilance even in apparently routine situations. Agent Chen stayed in contact with me for over a year after the trial, providing updates on related investigations and seeking advice about other suspicious cases. She told me that the network we'd exposed had been connected to international criminal organizations and that the investigation had led to additional arrests in Europe and Asia. Your willingness to trust your instincts and report suspicious activity probably prevented dozens of other drivers from being victimized, she said during one of our conversations. Most people in your situation would have rationalized the inconsistencies and completed the delivery, which would have made them unwitting accomplices in ongoing criminal operations. But the knowledge that I'd helped expose a major criminal network didn't eliminate the personal cost of the experience. 3 years later, I still think about that night in Little Rock every time I encounter unusual pickup requirements or unfamiliar shipping procedures. Every professional-looking person with a clipboard becomes a potential threat until proven otherwise. The road has taught me many lessons over more than 2 decades of driving, but the most expensive education came from a fake shipping facility that looked legitimate enough to fool an experienced driver. That education cost me weeks of lost income, years of elevated insurance premiums, and countless sleepless nights wondering what would have happened if I'd been less suspicious or more trusting. The case files from the investigation sit in my glove compartment, a reminder that the most dangerous criminals aren't always the ones you expect to meet in dark alleys. Sometimes they're wearing business suits and carrying clipboards, speaking your language and knowing exactly which procedures to follow to gain your trust. I still drive for Schneider National, still run long-haul routes across the country, and still love the freedom and independence that drew me to trucking in the first place. But I'm more careful now about who I trust and what I accept at face value. The industry has changed since that October night in 2023, with new security procedures and verification requirements designed to prevent the kind of fraud I experienced. Yet I know that criminals are adapting too. developing new methods to exploit whatever vulnerabilities exist in freight transportation systems. Somewhere out there, other drivers are pulling up to other fake facilities, accepting other fraudulent bills of lading, and trusting other professional-looking criminals who understand exactly how to exploit the systems we depend on to make our living. The only question is whether they'll be suspicious enough, observant enough, and lucky enough to recognize the danger before it's too late. In my case, a combination of experience, intuition, and considerable luck kept me from becoming another casualty in the ongoing evolution of freight crime. But I know that luck doesn't last forever, and the criminals are getting smarter every year, studying our industry, learning our procedures, and developing new ways to turn honest drivers into unwitting accomplices in increasingly sophisticated criminal enterprises. The road ahead remains uncertain, full of legitimate opportunities and hidden dangers that look remarkably similar until you know what signs to watch for. The difference between a routine pickup and a criminal trap might be nothing more than a logistics coordinator wearing the wrong shoes for a loading dock, or workers who move like they're not quite familiar with procedures they should know by heart. Sometimes the most valuable freight you haul isn't in your trailer. It's the hard-earned knowledge of when to trust your instincts and when to ask the difficult questions that might save your career and your freedom. That knowledge came at a steep price, but it's proven invaluable in the years since that midnight encounter with criminals who understood trucking well enough to exploit it. The Meridian Industrial Solutions case became a landmark investigation that changed how law enforcement and industry officials think about freight security. But for me, it will always be a reminder that in trucking, nothing is ever as simple as it appears, and the most professional-looking operation might be the most dangerous one you'll ever encounter. 3 years later, when new drivers ask me for advice about staying safe on the road, I tell them about that night in Little Rock. I explain how easy it is to be fooled by criminals who do their homework, and how important it is to trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right. Because sometimes the difference between a successful career and federal prison is nothing more than being willing to ask uncomfortable questions and insist on proper verification, even when everything looks legitimate and everyone seems professional. The road teaches many lessons to those willing to learn them. Mine came at a fake loading dock in Arkansas, from criminals who understood my industry well enough to exploit it. It was an expensive education, but one that probably saved me from much worse consequences in the years that followed. And every time I see those case files in my glove compartment, I'm reminded that in trucking, the most dangerous mile might be the one that leads to a loading dock where nothing is quite what it seems. Name's Frank Kowalski, and I've been pushing a big rig down America's highways for 27 years come this December. Started back in '96 when I was just 23, fresh out of the Marines with a chest full of ribbons from Desert Storm and no clear idea what to do with the rest of my life. A recruiter from Martin Transport came to a job fair in Milwaukee, handed me a brochure about seeing the country and making good money doing it. And 3 weeks later, I was in CDL school in Green Bay learning how to double clutch a 13-speed transmission. 27 years later, I'm still out here, though I've been an owner-operator for the last 15 years. My current rig is a 2018 Peterbilt 389 with a 72-inch sleeper, painted deep blue with chrome stacks that catch the sunlight just right when you're rolling westbound in the morning. She's got a Caterpillar C15 under the hood pushing 550 horsepower, paired with an 18-speed transmission that sings like a symphony when you know how to work the gears. Not the newest truck on the road, but she's paid for, and she's mine. I bought her from a driver named Tommy Hendricks who was retiring after 43 years behind the wheel. Tommy had spec'd her out exactly right. Comfortable driver's seat with air ride suspension, premium sound system, auxiliary power unit for climate control during rest periods, and enough chrome to make her shine like a jewel at truck shows. The interior was all business but comfortable, with a well-designed sleeper that included a small refrigerator, microwave, and enough storage for personal items and several weeks' worth of clothes. The truck came with a spotless maintenance record and all the upgrades that matter for long-haul work. Low rolling resistance tires for fuel economy, advanced GPS system with truck-specific routing, electronic logging device that interfaced seamlessly with my dispatch software, and a CB radio setup that could reach halfway across the country on a clear night. Tommy had treated her like family, and she showed it in every detail. When I first climbed into her cab 3 years ago, I knew I'd found my permanent ride. The seat adjusted perfectly to my 6'2" frame. The controls fell naturally under my hands, and the engine responded to throttle input like she was reading my mind. After driving company trucks for most of my career, owning this Peterbilt felt like the culmination of everything I'd worked toward since leaving the military. The military experience had prepared me well for trucking, though I didn't realize it at the time. In the Army, I'd been a logistics specialist, coordinating supply convoys between forward operating bases in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait during Desert Storm. The discipline, attention to detail, and ability to handle stress that the military had drilled into me translated perfectly to long-haul trucking. I understood the importance of maintaining equipment, following procedures, and staying alert during long hours of monotonous operation. After my discharge in 1995, I'd bounced around several different jobs, trying to find something that felt right. Construction work was too seasonal, factory jobs were mind-numbing, and office work made me feel trapped. When the Martin recruiter explained that trucking would let me see the country while earning good money, it sounded like the perfect solution for a restless ex-soldier who wasn't ready to settle down. My first years with Martin had been a revelation. The freedom of the open road, the satisfaction of moving important freight safely and efficiently, and the camaraderie among professional drivers created a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since leaving the military. I learned the geography of America from the driver's seat, memorizing routes and landmarks from coast to coast, developing the kind of road knowledge that only comes from thousands of hours behind the wheel. I'd run every type of freight imaginable over the years. Refrigerated food products that required precise temperature control, hazardous materials that demanded special handling and routing, oversized loads that challenged every aspect of driving skill, and high-value electronics that came with armed escorts and satellite tracking. Each type of freight taught me something new about the trucking industry and the vital role drivers played in keeping America's economy moving. But my favorite loads were always the long hauls across the heartland, grain from Kansas wheat fields to processing plants in Texas, manufactured goods from Midwest factories to distribution centers on the coasts, and raw materials that formed the backbone of American industry. These runs took me through small towns and rural areas where trucking was still respected as an honorable profession, where people understood that everything in their stores had arrived on a truck driven by someone like me. What I'm about to tell you happened in February 2024 during what should have been a routine run from Chicago to Phoenix. I'd been hauling a load of agricultural equipment, plows, cultivators, irrigation components, and specialty farming tools destined for farms and equipment dealers throughout the Southwest. The freight was properly secured and well-balanced, with a total weight of 47,000 pounds that put me comfortably under the 80,000-pound gross vehicle weight limit. The shipper had been Johnson Agricultural Equipment, a family-owned business on the south side of Chicago that I'd worked with many times over the years. They manufactured and distributed farming equipment throughout the Midwest and Southwest, and they'd been a reliable source of freight for independent drivers like me who could provide personalized service and flexible scheduling. Bob Johnson, the company's dispatch manager, had briefed me personally on the load requirements. "Frank, this is specialty equipment heading to 6 different stops between Oklahoma City and Phoenix. The farmers are depending on this gear for spring planting, so timing is critical." The delivery schedule was ambitious but manageable. Oklahoma City on Wednesday, 2 stops in Texas on Thursday, New Mexico on Friday, and Phoenix on Saturday morning. If I managed my driving hours carefully and maintained good speed through each state, I could make all the appointments without pushing my logbook too hard. The load had been good to me so far. Picked up on time Monday morning from Johnson's facility, no problems with the paperwork, and the freight was properly secured with chains, binders, and tarps that would protect the equipment from road salt and weather. My electronic logging device showed I'd been managing my hours efficiently, taking breaks when required and maintaining the steady pace that had become second nature after nearly 3 decades on the road. I'd been running steady since Monday morning, making my way south through Illinois and into Missouri on Interstate 55, then west on Interstate 44 toward Oklahoma. The weather had been cooperating. Clear skies, dry roads, and moderate temperatures that made for comfortable driving conditions. My Peterbilt was running smooth as silk, the cat engine purring like a contented lion as we rolled through the rolling hills and farmland that stretched to the horizon. By Tuesday evening, I was making excellent time through Missouri, about 200 miles west of St. Louis on I-44. The landscape was classic Midwest farmland, endless fields of corn stubble and wheat shoots, scattered farmhouses with warm lights in the windows, and small towns built around grain elevators and railroad crossings. This was the America I'd fallen in love with during my early years of trucking, the heartland that reminded me why I'd chosen this profession. The traffic was light for a Tuesday evening, mostly local cars and a scattered handful of other trucks running their own routes toward destinations across the Southwest. I'd passed a few other drivers during the day, exchanging brief waves or CB conversations about road conditions and fuel prices. The trucking community remained strong despite all the changes the industry had undergone, and there was still satisfaction in being part of that community. This was the kind of peaceful night driving that reminded me why I'd stayed in trucking for nearly 3 decades. No traffic jams, no construction delays, no dispatchers breathing down my neck about delivery times. Just the steady rhythm of diesel engine and road noise, the gentle sway of the cab as we rolled over the expansion joints, and the endless ribbon of white lines disappearing under my headlights like a meditation on motion and purpose. The CB radio had been providing its usual soundtrack of professional chatter throughout the evening. Channel 19 carried the voices of drivers sharing information about road conditions, fuel prices, construction zones, and the general gossip that helped pass the time during long hauls. The conversation had been typical for a Tuesday night in February. Light traffic reports, warnings about black ice in the Ozark Mountains, discussions about the best truck stops for showers and food, and the friendly banter that connected drivers across hundreds of miles of highway. I'd been monitoring the radio passively, occasionally contributing information about conditions I'd observed or responding to specific questions from other drivers. The CB remained an essential tool for professional drivers, providing real-time information about hazards, traffic, and road conditions that wasn't available through any other source. Despite the proliferation of smartphones and GPS systems, nothing replaced the immediate local knowledge shared by drivers who were actually traveling the roads. Around 11:30 p.m., somewhere between Lebanon and Springfield, Missouri, I heard a transmission that caught my attention. The voice was clear and strong, cutting through the static with the professional tone of an experienced driver who knew how to use his radio effectively. Breaker 19, this is Iron Horse westbound on 4-4 at the 1:40 marker. Looking for a southbound report on conditions down toward Arkansas. Anyone got ears on? The transmission had the crisp clarity and proper protocol that marked an experienced professional. The driver identified himself with a clear handle, provided his location and direction of travel, and asked a specific question about road conditions ahead. It was exactly the kind of CB communication that made the highway community function effectively. I keyed my microphone to respond, following the same professional standards I'd maintained throughout my career. Iron Horse, this is Blue Pete westbound, about 20 miles ahead of you. Roads are clear and dry. Light traffic, temperature holding steady around 38 degrees. No problems to report on your southbound routing. Much appreciated, Blue Pete. How's the fuel situation down in Springfield? Need to top off before I hit the long stretch through Oklahoma. Pilot on the south side's got competitive prices, I replied, recalling my own fuel stop earlier in the evening. Clean facility, good fuel, easy truck access. I stopped there myself about 2 hours ago. Diesel was running about 15 cents under the national average. Thanks for the heads up, Blue Pete. Safe travels out there. Same to you, Iron Horse. Keep the shiny side up. It was a standard CB exchange between professional drivers, the kind of helpful interaction that happened thousands of times a day across the highway system. Nothing unusual about the conversation except that the voice had a quality that seemed somehow familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have heard it before. The radio handle Iron Horse wasn't one I recognized, but with thousands of drivers using Channel 19 across the country, that wasn't particularly significant. The voice had the distinctive cadence and terminology of a career trucker, someone who'd spent years on the road and knew the language and customs of the profession. There were subtle indicators in how he structured his transmissions, his choice of words, and his radio etiquette that marked him as an experienced driver rather than a newcomer or casual CB user. I continued west through the Missouri night, maintaining my steady pace of 65 per and monitoring the radio for additional traffic reports. The landscape rolled by in the familiar pattern of hills and valleys, with occasional lights from farmhouses and small towns breaking the darkness. My truck was running perfectly, all gauges showing normal readings, and my load was riding smoothly without any signs of shifting or securement problems. About an hour later, as I was approaching Springfield, I heard Iron Horse again, this time talking to another driver about road conditions in Oklahoma. His voice still had that familiar quality, and I found myself paying closer attention to his transmissions, trying to place where I might have encountered him before. Breaker 19, Iron Horse looking for eastbound traffic on 4-4. Need a report on conditions around Tulsa and Oklahoma City. Anyone been through there recently? An eastbound driver responded with current information about construction zones and traffic patterns around the Oklahoma metropolitan area. Iron Horse thanked him professionally and signed off, but something about his transmission style bothered me. The way he phrased his questions, his knowledge of the routes, even his radio etiquette. It all seemed exactly like conversations I'd had with drivers I'd known for years, yet I couldn't identify him specifically. The familiarity was nagging at me, like trying to remember a name that was right on the tip of my tongue. Iron Horse's voice had the distinctive characteristics of someone I'd talked with before, but I couldn't recall the circumstances or time frame of our previous contact. I decided to try to establish more direct contact and see if Iron Horse was someone I'd worked with or met during my years on the road. The trucking community was large but surprisingly interconnected, especially among drivers who'd been running the same routes for decades. It wasn't uncommon to encounter the same drivers repeatedly over the years, developing professional relationships and friendships based on shared routes and mutual respect. Iron Horse, this is Blue Pete. That voice sounds familiar to me. Have we talked before? I've been running these routes for about 15 years as an owner-operator, plus another 12 years driving company trucks. The response came back immediately, with the same professional tone and slight familiarity that had caught my attention. Blue Pete, could very well be. I've been out here a long time myself, running a lot of freight between the Midwest and Southwest. You sound familiar to me too? What kind of rig you pushing these days? 2018 Pete 389, blue paint with chrome stacks, Cat C15 under the hood. Bought her from a retiring driver about 3 years ago. How about you? Kenworth 900, red and black paint scheme, Cummins ISX power. Been running her for about 8 years now. Nice truck, but not as pretty as those Pete's. We continued chatting as we rolled through the Missouri countryside, sharing stories about routes, truck stops, equipment preferences, and the changes we'd seen in the industry over the years. Iron Horse's knowledge was extensive and detailed, offering specific information about fuel stops, way stations, construction zones, and shortcuts that only came from years of experience running these highways regularly. His knowledge of trucking operations was impressive and authentic. He spoke knowledgeably about different engine configurations, transmission options, and equipment specifications. He understood the complexities of hours of service regulations, the challenges of finding good parking during mandatory rest periods, and the economic pressures facing independent operators in an increasingly competitive industry. But as our conversation continued, I started noticing details that didn't quite align with current conditions. Iron Horse mentioned planning to stop at Murphy's Truck Plaza outside Joplin for fuel and a meal, describing it as one of his regular stops on this route. He praised their fuel prices, clean showers, and the quality of food in their restaurant. The problem was that Murphy's Truck Plaza had been closed for about 3 years. The facility had been demolished to make way for a shopping center development, and the truck stop that had served drivers for over 2 decades no longer existed. Any driver who regularly ran this route would have known about the closure, especially someone who claimed it as a regular stop. When I mentioned the closure, Iron Horse seemed genuinely surprised. "Is that right? Damn, I hate to hear that. Murphy's was one of the good ones. Clean facility, friendly staff, reasonable prices. Had some of the best coffee on this stretch of highway." His reaction seemed authentic, but the surprise suggested he hadn't been on this route recently enough to know about a closure that had happened several years ago. That was unusual for a driver who claimed to run regular freight between the Midwest and Southwest. I started paying closer attention to our conversation, listening for other details that might seem inconsistent with current conditions. Over the next hour, as we both continued west through Missouri and into Oklahoma, Iron Horse made several more references to facilities, routes, and conditions that no longer existed or had been significantly changed. He talked about construction projects on I-44 near Rolla that had been completed 2 years ago, referring to them as ongoing traffic problems. He mentioned fuel prices that were substantially lower than current rates, discussing strategies for finding cheap diesel that would have been relevant several years ago, but not in the current market. Most concerning were his references to specific accidents and incidents that had occurred on these routes. He warned me about a dangerous curve near the Oklahoma border where a driver had rolled his rig last winter, providing detailed information about the location, road conditions, and circumstances of the accident. When I later checked my mental database of incidents I'd heard about through the driver network, I found that such an accident had indeed occurred, but it had happened 4 years ago, not the previous winter. The details Iron Horse provided were accurate, but his timeline was significantly off. Despite these inconsistencies, Iron Horse's knowledge of trucking procedures and industry details was impeccable. He spoke the language of professional drivers fluently, understood the technical aspects of equipment maintenance and operation, and demonstrated the kind of road wisdom that only came from decades of experience. His radio etiquette was perfect. His route knowledge was extensive, and his manner of speaking had the authentic cadence of a career trucker. The contradictions were puzzling rather than alarming. Many drivers had stories about routes and facilities from years past, and it wasn't uncommon for details to become confused over time. Truck stops changed ownership, construction projects came and went, and the specific details of accidents and incidents could blur together in memory after years of hearing similar stories. Around 1:30 a.m., as I was approaching Tulsa, Oklahoma, Iron Horse made a transmission that fundamentally changed the nature of our conversation and introduced a personal element that made me more invested in our interaction. "Blue Pete, I've been thinking about our chat tonight, and I want to ask you something personal if you don't mind. You mentioned running these routes for 27 years total. What year did you start driving truck?"
1996.
I replied, comfortable sharing basic career information with a fellow professional. Started with Martin Transport right out of the Marines. Been a good career. Seen a lot of changes in the industry. Military background, huh? What branch? Army. Did my time during Desert Storm logistics specialist. Seemed like a natural transition to civilian trucking. No kidding. I was there myself. 2nd Armored Division, Transportation Corps. Spent most of my deployment running supply convoys between bases and forward positions. The conversation had taken a personal turn that made me much more comfortable with Iron Horse. Military veterans often gravitated toward trucking after their service, finding familiar elements in the discipline, responsibility, and mission-oriented nature of professional driving. Shared military experience created an immediate bond that transcended the usual barriers between strangers on the CB radio. "What unit were you with?" I asked, genuinely interested in learning more about a fellow veteran who'd followed a similar career path. Transportation Corps, attached to various units as needed for convoy operations. Spent a lot of time moving supplies and equipment through some pretty hairy territory. Good training for civilian trucking. Learned how to handle heavy vehicles, maintain equipment under tough conditions, and stay alert during long hours of operation. We talked for another 30 minutes about our military experiences, finding common ground in shared memories of desert operations, convoy procedures, and the challenges of transitioning to civilian life. Iron Horse's knowledge of military logistics was detailed and accurate, reinforcing his credibility as a fellow veteran and experienced driver. His military stories had the ring of authenticity that came from personal experience rather than second-hand accounts. He understood the specific challenges of desert convoy operations, the importance of vehicle maintenance in harsh conditions, and the psychological demands of operating heavy equipment in potentially dangerous situations. The military connection also explained some of the familiarity I'd felt with his voice and communication style. Veterans often carried distinctive patterns of speech and radio discipline from their service, and those patterns remained recognizable years later when encountered in civilian contexts. But then Iron Horse said something that made my blood run cold and introduced an element of confusion that would dominate the rest of our conversation. "Blue Pete, I've got to ask you about something that's been bothering me. You mentioned running a Pete 389, blue paint, CAD engine. That's a nice rig. Sounds like a truck a professional would choose. But I have to ask, what happened to your old truck?" The question caught me completely off guard. I hadn't mentioned having a previous truck, and I wasn't sure why Iron Horse would assume I'd owned other equipment before the Peterbilt. Most drivers were proud of their rigs and would naturally mention their history if they'd owned multiple trucks. "I've only owned this one truck," I said, genuinely confused by his assumption. Before I went owner-operator, I drove company equipment for Martin Transport and a couple other carriers. This Pete is my first and only personal truck. There was a long pause before Iron Horse responded, and when he did, his voice had taken on a puzzled quality that suggested he was processing information that didn't match his expectations. "That's strange, Frank. I could have sworn you told me about a previous rig, maybe a different Peterbilt or a Kenworth. Blue truck, similar configuration. Maybe I'm thinking of someone else." The use of my first name stopped me cold. I hadn't told Iron Horse my name was Frank. I'd been using my CB handle Blue Pete throughout our conversation, and while some drivers used their real names on the radio, I'd made a point of maintaining the informal anonymity that was traditional for CB communication. "Iron Horse, I never told you my name was Frank. How do you know that?" Another pause, longer this time, filled with static and the distant hum of highway noise. When Iron Horse finally responded, his voice had changed subtly, becoming more distant and somehow less substantial, as if he was broadcasting from much farther away than our parallel routes would suggest. "Sorry about that, Blue Pete. Must have confused you with another driver. You know how it is out here. Talked to so many people over the years. Sometimes the details get mixed up." But I knew I hadn't mentioned my name, and the mistake bothered me more than it should have. Professional drivers were usually careful about personal information, especially when talking to strangers on open radio channels. The casual use of my first name suggested either a level of familiarity that we hadn't established, or access to information that I hadn't provided. I tried to let it go and resume our previous conversation, but the name issue had created an undercurrent of unease that colored everything else Iron Horse said. I found myself analyzing his words more carefully, looking for additional inconsistencies or details that didn't match the normal patterns of CB communication. As I rolled through Tulsa and continued west toward Oklahoma City, our conversation gradually resumed its earlier rhythm. Iron Horse provided route information, warned me about construction zones on the western outskirts of Oklahoma City, and shared observations about changes in the trucking industry over the past decade. But I remained alert for additional slips or references that might reveal how he knew more about me than our conversation had established. The construction warning he provided was accurate and helpful. As I approached the Oklahoma City metropolitan area, I encountered exactly the lane restrictions and reduced speed zones that Iron Horse had described. His knowledge of current road conditions was precise and up-to-date, which made his earlier references to closed facilities and outdated fuel prices even more puzzling. Around 3 o'clock a.m., as I was navigating the western bypass around Oklahoma City, Iron Horse made a transmission that introduced a new element of unease and shifted our conversation in a direction that would prove deeply unsettling. "Blue Pete, I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you're going to take it. I think there might be something you should know about the route you're running tonight." His tone had become more serious, almost somber, lacking the casual friendliness that had characterized our earlier conversation. "What do you mean?" "There have been some bad accidents on this stretch of highway over the years. Good drivers who didn't make it home. Professional people who were just trying to do their jobs, support their families, make honest livings." The shift in tone was dramatic and concerning. Iron Horse's voice had taken on a quality that seemed almost mournful, as if he was discussing personal losses rather than general highway safety statistics. "I want you to be extra careful through the next section, Frank. Watch your speed, maintain proper following distance, and don't take any chances with road conditions or other traffic. Some stretches of highway have a way of claiming good drivers when they least expect it." "Iron Horse, I appreciate the concern, but I've been running this route for years without serious problems. Is there something specific I should know about? A particular hazard or dangerous location?" "Just be careful, Blue Pete. Sometimes the road takes good drivers when you least expect it, and their families never get the chance to say goodbye properly." The cryptic nature of his warning was deeply troubling, especially combined with his earlier use of my first name and his knowledge of routes and facilities that seemed inconsistent with current conditions. Iron Horse was either trying to communicate something important in coded language, or he was experiencing some kind of mental confusion that affected his perception of time and circumstances. I thanked him for his concern and assured him that I would maintain safe driving practices, but his warning had created a heightened sense of alertness that made me more conscious of every aspect of my driving. I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, monitoring my speed more carefully, and paying closer attention to road conditions and potential hazards. For the next hour, our conversation returned to more routine topics: fuel prices, truck stop amenities, weather forecasts, and general industry gossip. But Iron Horse's warning had established an undercurrent of tension that made every exchange feel more significant than normal CB chatter. His knowledge of trucking operations remained impressive and authentic. He discussed the challenges of finding good parking during federally mandated rest periods, the economic pressures facing independent operators, and the technological changes that were reshaping the industry. His observations were insightful and demonstrated the kind of deep understanding that only came from years of professional experience. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was wrong with our conversation. The accumulation of small inconsistencies, outdated facility information, confused timelines, knowledge of my name, cryptic warnings about road dangers, suggested that Iron Horse was either deliberately misleading me or operating under some kind of misapprehension about current reality. Around 4:30 a.m., as I was approaching the Texas border on Interstate 40, Iron Horse made a transmission that revealed information that fundamentally altered my understanding of our entire conversation and introduced possibilities that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality. Blue Pete, I've been thinking about what you said earlier about starting your career with Martin Transport. That was a good company to learn with. Solid equipment, decent training program, professional management. I knew another driver there, ran a lot of the same routes you mentioned. Name was Frank Kowalski. Good guy, safe driver, real professional. You ever know him? My hands tightened involuntarily on the steering wheel. The casualness of his question contrasted sharply with the bombshell nature of what he was asking. Iron Horse. My name is Frank Kowalski. The silence that followed was longer and more profound than any pause in our conversation. The CB crackled with static, and I could hear the distant hum of highway noise, but Iron Horse's voice was completely absent for what felt like several minutes. When he finally responded, his voice had changed fundamentally, becoming more distant and somehow less substantial, as if he was broadcasting from a much greater distance or through some kind of atmospheric interference. Frank Kowalski. Yeah, I remember Frank. Good driver. Safe and professional. Always maintained his equipment properly. Never took unnecessary risks. He was running a blue Peterbilt, just like the one you described. Iron Horse. I am Frank Kowalski. We've been talking for hours. I told you my name was Frank when you mentioned it earlier. What are you saying? Another long pause filled with static and the sound of wind that seemed to come from impossibly far away. Frank Kowalski died in an accident about 4 years ago. Rolled his truck on a curve outside Joplin, Missouri. February 18th, 2020. They said he fell asleep at the wheel, but Frank was too professional for that. Something else happened on that curve. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I was Frank Kowalski. I was alive, driving my truck, hauling freight to Phoenix, talking on the CB radio with someone who claimed to know about my death. Either I was experiencing some kind of psychotic break from too many years of isolated night driving, or I was having a conversation with someone who shouldn't exist. Iron Horse, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm Frank Kowalski, and I'm very much alive. I know this is confusing, Frank. It was confusing for me too at first. The accident happened on February 18th, 2020. You were westbound on Interstate 44, about 10 miles east of Joplin. Dangerous curve with a history of accidents. Black ice on the road surface. I knew the curve he was talking about. It was a notorious location where several drivers had lost control over the years. A sweeping right-hand turn that tightened unexpectedly and caught unwary drivers at excessive speed. The Missouri Department of Transportation had installed additional warning signs and reduced the speed limit, but accidents continued to occur during adverse weather conditions. But I had no memory of any accident at that location. I remembered driving through that area hundreds of times over the years without incident, always taking extra care because of its reputation for danger. I'd never had any serious accidents anywhere on my routes, certainly nothing involving a rollover or life-threatening injuries. Iron Horse, you're wrong. I've never had an accident at that location. I've never had any serious accidents during my entire career. Check your logbook, Frank. What's the date today? I glanced at my electronic logging device, which displayed current date and time information along with my hours of service status. The screen showed February 18th, 2024, exactly 4 years from the date Iron Horse claimed I'd been killed. Today's February 18th, 2024. And what date do you remember starting this current trip? I tried to recall when I'd picked up the load in Chicago. The memories seemed clear enough. Monday morning pickup at Johnson Agricultural Equipment, routine paperwork and loading procedures, normal departure protocols. But when I tried to focus on specific details, they became fuzzy and indistinct, lacking the sharp clarity that recent memories should possess. Monday, February 15th, I think. Frank, today is Tuesday night going into Wednesday morning. If you started Monday, you've only been driving for about 36 hours. But you told me earlier that you'd been making good time since Monday morning. That timeline doesn't work with current date and your current location. Iron Horse was absolutely correct. The timeline didn't add up properly. If I'd started Monday morning in Chicago and today was Tuesday night, I shouldn't have had enough legal driving time to reach my current location in Oklahoma while maintaining compliance with hours of service regulations. Something was fundamentally wrong with my perception of time and distance. Iron Horse, I don't understand what's happening to me. I didn't understand either at first. But I think we're stuck somehow, Frank. Repeating the same routes, the same trips, over and over. I've been running this same load for 4 years, trying to complete a delivery that never seems to happen. The implications of what he was suggesting were too terrible to accept. But as I thought about the details of my current trip, I realized I couldn't clearly remember completing previous deliveries or returning home to Wisconsin. My memories of recent trips were vague and incomplete, lacking the specific details that should have been fresh and clear. I tried to recall my last conversation with my daughter Sarah, who was studying nursing at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I could remember her voice, her laugh, her excitement about her studies, but I couldn't pin down exactly when we'd last talked or what we'd discussed. The memory was there, but seemed to lack temporal specificity. Similarly, I couldn't clearly remember my last visit home to my apartment in Green Bay, my last conversation with my insurance agent about equipment coverage, or my last meeting with my accountant about quarterly taxes. All of these routine aspects of an owner-operator's business should have been recent and memorable, but they seemed distant and indistinct. Iron Horse, what's your real name? Robert Chen, Bobby to my friends and family. I was running for Trans Am Trucking when it happened. February 11th, 2020. Jackknifed in a snowstorm outside Flagstaff, Arizona. Lost control on a downgrade. Truck rolled down an embankment. February 11th, 2020. 7 days before the date he claimed I'd been killed. If Iron Horse, Bobby Chen, was telling the truth about both of our deaths, we were both deceased drivers, somehow continuing to run the same routes we'd traveled in life. Bobby, if what you're saying is true, why are we still here? Why are we still driving? I don't know for certain, Frank, but I think it has something to do with unfinished business. Loads that didn't get delivered. Families that didn't get proper goodbyes. Maybe we're stuck in some kind of loop until we figure out how to let go of the life we lost. I tried to process what Bobby was telling me, but it contradicted everything I understood about reality and existence. I felt completely alive, my hands on the steering wheel, the vibration of the engine through the cab floor, the taste of coffee from my last truck stop. How could any of this be real if I was actually dead? Bobby, this doesn't make sense. I can feel everything. The steering wheel, the engine vibration, the taste of coffee. I can hear our conversation clearly. How can any of this be real if we're dead? I don't think the normal rules apply to our situation, Frank. We're existing in some kind of space between life and death. Maybe because we died doing what we loved most. The road was our life, so maybe the road has become our afterlife too. As we continued west through the Oklahoma night, Bobby shared more details about his experience since his accident 4 years ago. He'd been repeating variations of the same trip, a load of steel coil from Chicago to Los Angeles, never successfully completing the delivery, never returning home to his family in Houston. I've tried everything, Frank. Different routes, different speeds, stopping at different truck stops, even trying to abandon the load. Nothing changes the fundamental pattern. I always end up back at the beginning, picking up the same freight, starting the same trip that never reaches its destination. Have you encountered other drivers like us? A few, over the years. Most don't realize what's happened to them. They think they're still alive, still working, still trying to get home to their families. But some eventually figure it out, usually when they notice inconsistencies like the ones you picked up on tonight. Bobby's story was both terrifying and heartbreaking. The idea that dead drivers might be trapped in endless loops, forever trying to complete journeys they'd never finish, was almost too awful to contemplate. But it explained all the inconsistencies I'd noticed in our conversation. His references to closed truck stops, outdated fuel prices, and road conditions that no longer existed. Bobby, how do we break free from this? How do we find peace and move on? I've been searching for answers for 4 years, Frank. I think it might have something to do with acceptance, letting go of the need to complete the trip and accepting that our time on the road has ended. As dawn began to break over the Oklahoma landscape, our conversation took on a different quality. Bobby's voice seemed to be growing fainter through the CB static, as if he was moving away from me despite our supposedly parallel routes on the same highway. Frank, I need to tell you something important. This might be the last time we can talk. I think I'm finally ready to let go. What do you mean? I've been holding on to this route, this truck, this life, because I wasn't ready to say goodbye to everything I'd worked for. But talking with you tonight has helped me understand that it's time to move on, time to accept what happened and find peace. Bobby's voice was now barely audible through the CB static, fading in and out like a distant radio station at the edge of its broadcast range. Frank, you have a choice to make. You can keep running this route forever, trapped in the same loop I've been stuck in for 4 years, or you can choose to let go and find whatever peace waits beyond this highway. Bobby, wait. I have more questions. I need to understand what happened to me, how I died, why I can't remember. But there was no response. Channel 19 had gone completely silent, filled only with the soft hiss of static. I tried calling for Bobby repeatedly on multiple channels, but got no answer. It was as if he had simply vanished from the airwaves, leaving me alone with questions that seemed to have no answers. As the sun rose higher over the Oklahoma plains, I began to notice something profoundly disturbing about the landscape around me. The highway looked familiar. The same white lines, the same green exit signs, the same rolling terrain I'd traveled thousands of times. But something was subtly wrong with everything I was seeing. The exits weren't quite in the right places. Mile markers seemed to appear at inconsistent intervals. The surrounding terrain had a dreamlike quality that was almost, but not quite, like the real Interstate 40 I knew so well. It was like driving through a place that was trying to be the familiar highway but couldn't quite achieve perfect accuracy. More unsettling was the complete absence of other traffic. For the past several hours, I hadn't seen a single car, truck, or emergency vehicle. The highway was utterly empty except for my Peterbilt rolling through the morning light. The absence of other vehicles was eerie and unnatural, unlike anything I'd experienced in nearly 3 decades of driving. I tried to contact other drivers on my CB radio, scanning through all 40 channels. Nothing but static. No morning commuter chatter, no reports about road conditions, no idle conversation between drivers starting their day. The radio spectrum was completely empty, as if I was the only person in the world with a functioning CB. When I tried to call my dispatcher on my cell phone, I discovered something even more disturbing. The phone showed full signal strength, but calls wouldn't connect. Numbers I dialed would ring once or twice, then disconnect. Text messages appeared to send successfully, but never received responses. It was as if all communication with the outside world had been severed. I pulled into a truck stop near Oklahoma City, hoping to find other people and get some answers about what was happening to me. The facility looked normal from the outside. Familiar corporate signage, proper lighting, several vehicles scattered around the parking lot. But when I walked inside, I found it completely empty. The building was pristine and fully stocked, but there were no customers, no employees, no signs of recent human activity. Coffee pots were full but cold. Food displays were perfectly arranged but stale, and cash registers were operational but unmanned. It was like walking through a movie set designed to look like a functioning truck stop, but lacking any actual life. The restrooms were clean and well-maintained. The vending machines were fully stocked and operational, and all the facilities appeared to be in working order. But the absence of any human presence was deeply unsettling. I called out several times, hoping to locate an employee or another customer, but my voice echoed through empty corridors without response. Back in my truck, I tried the CB radio again, desperately scanning through all available channels. Nothing but static. No other drivers. No emergency broadcasts. No sign that anyone else existed in this strange version of reality I seemed to be trapped in. That's when I began to seriously consider the possibility that Bobby Chen had been telling the truth. I was dead, killed in an accident 4 years ago, and somehow trapped in a simulation or afterlife version of the routes I'd driven in life. The empty highways, the silent radio channels, and the absence of human contact all suggested that I was existing in some kind of isolated reality. The thought was terrifying, but it also provided a potential explanation for all the inconsistencies I'd been experiencing. If I was dead, it would explain why I couldn't clearly remember recent events, why my timeline seemed confused, and why I was encountering other drivers who also seemed to be trapped in impossible situations. I thought about my family back in Wisconsin, my daughter Sarah, who would now be 26 years old if 4 years had passed since my death. I thought about my ex-wife Janet, who I'd remained on friendly terms with despite our divorce. I thought about my few close friends in the trucking community, drivers I'd known for years and considered family. If I was really dead, they would have grieved for me, buried me, and moved on with their lives. Sarah would have finished nursing school without her father there to celebrate her graduation. Janet would have found someone new to share her life with. My friends would have shared stories about me at truck stops and industry gatherings, keeping my memory alive in the way that truckers honored their fallen brothers. The thought that I'd been absent from their lives for 4 years without knowing it was devastating. But it also explained why I'd felt increasingly disconnected from normal life, why my memories of home and family seemed distant and indistinct. I tried to recall the specific details of the accident Bobby had described. The curve near Joplin, the black ice, the rollover that had ended my life. As I focused on that time frame, fragments of memory began to surface like debris rising from the bottom of a deep lake. I remembered leaving Oklahoma City late at night on February 18, 2020, making good time toward my delivery appointment in Arkansas. I remembered being slightly behind schedule and pushing harder than usual to make up time. I remembered the weather forecast calling for possible ice on elevated surfaces, but the roads had seemed clear and safe. And then I remembered entering a curve at what felt like a safe speed, confident in my ability to handle the road conditions. I remembered the terrifying moment when my trailer tires lost traction on a patch of black ice that was invisible in my headlights. The awful sensation of the trailer beginning to slide sideways, the steering wheel going light in my hands, and the sickening knowledge that I was about to lose control of 80,000 pounds of truck and trailer. The memories flooded back with devastating clarity. The rollover, the crushing impact as my cab hit the pavement, the brief moments of consciousness as I realized I wasn't going to survive. The last thing I clearly remembered was thinking about Sarah, hoping she would be okay without her father, wishing I could tell her how proud I was of the woman she'd become. I had died on that curve near Joplin, just as Bobby had said. Everything since then, the years of driving, the loads, the routes, the conversations with other drivers, had been some kind of afterlife projection, a continuation of the life I'd lost because I wasn't ready to let go. With that realization came a profound mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the life I'd lost and the years I'd missed with my family. Relief that I finally understood what had happened and could make a conscious choice about what to do next. I thought about Bobby's words regarding the need to accept that our time on the road was finished and let go of the need to complete journeys that would never end. I understood now that I'd been holding on to trucking because it had been my identity, my purpose, my way of understanding myself and my place in the world. But holding on was keeping me trapped in a limbo that served no purpose except to prolong my inability to accept death. My family had grieved for me and continued with their lives. My truck had been salvaged or scrapped. My CDL had been canceled. The Frank Kowalski who had lived and driven for 27 years was gone, and it was time to acknowledge that reality. The acceptance didn't come easily. Everything about my existence for the past 4 years had been built around the assumption that I was still alive, still working, still moving toward a future that included more years on the road and eventual retirement. Letting go of that assumption meant letting go of everything I'd thought I was. I climbed down from my cab and walked around my Peterbilt one last time, running my hands over the chrome, checking the tires, inspecting the trailer connections that had been second nature for nearly 3 decades. This truck had been my partner, my home away from home, and my means of making a living. Saying goodbye to it meant saying goodbye to everything I'd been. The truck felt solid and real beneath my touch, but I understood now that its reality was different from the reality of the living world. It existed in whatever space I'd been occupying since my death, a space that allowed me to continue the routines and activities that had defined my life. I thought about Sarah, now a registered nurse working in a hospital somewhere, probably married with children of her own. I thought about Janet, who had likely found someone new to share her later years with. I thought about all the sunrises I'd seen from my driver's seat, all the miles I'd covered, and all the satisfaction I'd derived from moving freight safely and efficiently across the country. I'd lived a good life, even if it had ended sooner than I'd hoped. I'd seen America from coast to coast, met thousands of good people, and earned an honest living doing work that mattered to the economy and society. The fact that it was over didn't diminish the value of what I'd accomplished. Standing beside my truck in that empty rest area, I began to understand what Bobby had been trying to tell me about acceptance and letting go. The choice wasn't between different routes or different destinations. It was between clinging to a life that had already ended and accepting the transition to whatever came next. "Goodbye, old girl," I said, patting the hood of my Peterbilt. "Thanks for all the good miles. Thanks for being the best partner a driver could ask for." I felt a profound sense of peace beginning to settle over me as I accepted that my driving career was finished. The truck, the highway, the endless routes, they were all part of a life that had ended 4 years ago in an icy curve near Joplin, Missouri. As I stood there, the landscape around me began to change subtly. The highway seemed to stretch away into infinite distance, becoming less substantial and more ethereal. The truck became translucent, as if it was fading from one reality into another. The morning sun took on a quality of light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. I thought I heard Bobby's voice one last time, carried on a wind that seemed to blow from another dimension. "Safe travels, Frank. See you down the road, brother." And then the highway, the truck, and the familiar world of diesel engines and CB radios began to fade around me. I felt myself moving towards something that might have been peace, or home, or whatever waited beyond the last mile marker on the final highway. The CB radio crackled once more with static, then went silent forever. But the story doesn't end with my acceptance and transition, because on February 18th, 2028, exactly 8 years after my death, another driver named Miguel Santos was running westbound on Interstate 44 through Missouri when his CB radio picked up a faint transmission that seemed to come from very far away. The voice was clear but distant, like someone broadcasting from across an impossible distance. "Breaker 19, this is Blue Pete westbound on 44, looking for Iron Horse. You got your ears on, Bobby?" Miguel keyed his microphone to respond, thinking he might be able to help a driver locate another trucker. But before he could speak, another voice answered the call. "Blue Pete, this is Iron Horse. Good to hear from you again, Frank. How's the road treating you tonight?" "Can't complain, Bobby. Just making miles and staying safe. You know how it is out here." Miguel listened in fascination as the two drivers continued their conversation, sharing information about routes, weather conditions, and truck stop amenities. Their voices had a distant, ethereal quality that made him wonder if he was somehow picking up atmospheric skip from a very distant repeater station. But what bothered Miguel most was that both drivers seemed to be discussing road conditions, fuel prices, and truck stops that no longer existed. They talked about facilities that had been closed for years and construction projects that had been completed long ago. Their conversation had an anachronistic quality that suggested they were broadcasting from a different time period entirely. When Miguel tried to join the conversation, his transmissions seemed to go unheard. Blue Pete and Iron Horse continued their dialogue as if he wasn't there, sharing memories of highways they'd traveled and loads they'd hauled in what seemed like a different era of trucking. "Remember that time we both got caught in that ice storm outside Tulsa?" Blue Pete was saying. "Took us 6 hours to travel 20 miles. "I remember," Iron Horse replied. "Good thing we found that truck stop with the generator. Kept us warm until the roads cleared." Those were the days, Bobby, when trucking was still about the relationship between a driver and his rig, before all the electronic monitoring and corporate efficiency experts. Still is, Frank. Still is, for those of us who understand what it really means to be a driver. Miguel realized he was listening to something extraordinary. A conversation between drivers who seemed to exist outside normal time and space, sharing memories and experiences from a golden age of trucking that younger drivers had never experienced. Eventually, their voices faded into static, leaving Miguel alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that he'd somehow overheard a conversation between drivers who belonged to a different reality. He tried calling for Blue Pete and Iron Horse on multiple channels, but never received a response. Over the following months, Miguel mentioned the incident to other drivers at truck stops and on CB forums. He learned that several other drivers had reported similar experiences, phantom conversations between truckers who seemed to be broadcasting from the past, discussing routes and conditions that no longer existed. An old-timer named Harvey Williams, who'd been driving since the 1970s, had a theory about the phenomenon. "Some drivers never really retire," he told Miguel over coffee at a Flying J in Missouri. "They get so attached to the road that part of them stays out here even after their time is up. Maybe what you heard was Frank and Bobby still running their routes, still looking out for each other, still being the kind of drivers this industry was built on." Miguel never heard from Blue Pete or Iron Horse again, but he started paying closer attention to the static between stations on his CB radio. Sometimes, late at night on empty highways, he would scan the channels carefully, listening for voices that might be broadcasting from beyond the normal boundaries of time and space. He learned that the highway was more than just a means of transportation. It was a place where stories accumulated, where the spirits of good drivers might continue their journeys long after their earthly miles had been completed. The CB radio, which had connected drivers across vast distances for decades, might also be capable of connecting different eras and different planes of existence. Other drivers began sharing their own experiences with phantom radio transmissions. Reports came in from across the country, conversations between truckers who had died years apart, broadcasts from drivers warning about accidents that had happened decades earlier, and technical discussions about equipment that was no longer manufactured. The phenomenon became known among drivers as the Eternal Highway, a network of routes that existed parallel to the physical interstate system, where the spirits of deceased drivers continued their runs and maintained their watch over the living truckers who followed in their tire tracks. Some drivers were skeptical, attributing the reports to atmospheric interference, overactive imaginations, or the psychological effects of too many hours alone on the road. But others found comfort in the idea that death didn't necessarily end a driver's connection to the highway community. For Miguel, the experience changed how he approached his own career. He began to see trucking not just as a job, but as participation in a tradition that transcended individual lifetimes. Every mile he drove was part of an ongoing story that connected him to drivers who had come before and would continue with drivers who came after. He started keeping a journal of his experiences on the road, documenting not just his loads and routes, but the conversations he had with other drivers, the acts of kindness he witnessed, and the sense of community that still existed among professional truckers, despite all the changes in the industry. Years later, when Miguel finally hung up his keys and retired from driving, he donated his journals to a trucking museum in Iowa. The curator, a former driver herself, read through Miguel's accounts with deep appreciation for the stories he'd preserved. "These voices you heard," she told him during the donation ceremony, "they represent something important about trucking culture. The idea that good drivers look out for each other, even beyond death. Whether the transmissions were real or imaginary doesn't matter as much as what they represent. The eternal bond between professional drivers and the highway." The museum created an exhibit based on Miguel's journals and the reports from other drivers about phantom CB transmissions. Visitors could sit in a recreation of a truck cab, put on headphones, and listen to recordings of the conversations that drivers claimed to have heard from beyond. The exhibit became one of the museum's most popular attractions, drawing visitors from across the trucking community who came to pay their respects to drivers who had passed on and to reflect on the spiritual dimensions of life on the road. But perhaps the most important aspect of the phenomenon was how it influenced the behavior of living drivers. Knowing that their voices might someday join the phantom broadcasts made many drivers more conscious of how they conducted themselves on the road. They spoke more professionally on their CB radios, offered more assistance to fellow drivers, and maintained higher standards of courtesy and safety. The idea that Frank Kowalski and Bobby Chen might still be monitoring Channel 19 inspired a new generation of drivers to uphold the traditions and values that had made trucking a respected profession. Their posthumous presence became a reminder that every driver was part of something larger than themselves, a community that transcended the boundaries between life and death. And so the highway continues, carrying freight and dreams, stories and spirits across the vast American landscape. The white lines stretch endlessly toward horizons that might be geographic or metaphysical, and the CB radio crackles with voices that might be from this world or the next. For those who listen carefully to the static between stations, the highway offers more than just a route from point A to point B. It provides a connection to the eternal community of drivers who understand that some journeys never really end. They just continue on roads that can't be found on any earthly map. The diesel engines sing their ancient songs, the wheels turn their endless rotations, and somewhere in the space between the temporal and the eternal, good drivers continue their runs, still watching out for each other, still sharing the road wisdom that makes the highway a sacred space for those who understand its deeper meanings. Safe travels, drivers. Keep your eyes on the road, your hands on the wheel, and your ears tuned to Channel 19. You never know when you might hear from an old friend who's still out there making miles on the highway that never ends. And if you're ever running westbound on Interstate 44 through Missouri on a clear February night, and your CB picks up a conversation between Blue Pete and Iron Horse, key your microphone and say hello. They'll be glad to hear from a fellow driver, and they might have some road wisdom to share from their journeys on the other side of the final way station. Because in trucking, no driver is ever truly alone, and no journey ever really ends. The highway stretches on forever, and somewhere out there, Frank Kowalski and Bobby Chen are still making their runs, still looking out for the drivers who follow in their paths, still proving that the bond between professional truckers transcends the boundaries between this world and whatever lies beyond the last exit sign. The road goes on. The drivers continue their watch, and the CB radio keeps broadcasting the stories that connect us all, living and dead, past and present, on the eternal highway that runs through the heart of America and into the infinite distance where all good drivers eventually find their way home. They call me Diesel Betty, and I've been hauling freight across this country's highways for 31 years come next month. Started driving in 1992 when I was 26 years old, fresh out of a messy divorce in Bakersfield, California, with nothing but a high school diploma, a commercial driver's license, and enough anger to fuel a Peterbilt from coast to coast. 3 decades later, I'm still out here, still moving America's freight, and still proving that a woman can handle anything the road throws at her. My current rig is a 2019 Kenworth W900L with an 86-inch sleeper berth that I've turned into a proper home away from home. She's painted candy apple red with gold leaf pinstriping, custom leather interior, and enough chrome to blind a state trooper at a quarter mile. Under the hood sits a Cummins X15 engine pushing 605 horsepower through an Eaton Fuller 18-speed transmission that I can work like a concert pianist playing a Steinway. Not many drivers, male or female, can say they've logged over 4 million safe miles, but I can, and I've got the awards and clean driving record to prove it. I've been an owner-operator for the past 23 years, running primarily under my own authority with a few select brokers who know I deliver on time, every time, no excuses. My specialty is high-value electronics and pharmaceuticals, loads that require security clearances, GPS tracking, and the kind of reliability that comes from decades of professional experience. The freight pays well because it demands the best, and I've built my reputation on being exactly that. What I'm about to tell you happened in March 2024, during what should have been a routine delivery run from San Jose, California, to a pharmaceutical distribution center outside Nashville, Tennessee. I'd been hauling a load of specialty medications worth approximately $3.8 million, insulin pumps, cancer treatments, and cardiac devices that hospitals across the Southeast were waiting for, time-sensitive freight that could mean the difference between life and death for the patients who needed it. The load had originated from Biomed Technologies, a manufacturer I'd worked with for over a decade. They specialized in producing high-end medical devices and medications that required careful handling and precise temperature control during transport. My trailer was equipped with a state-of-the-art refrigeration unit, GPS monitoring system, and security features that would make Fort Knox jealous. Sarah Chen, the shipping manager at Biomed, had briefed me personally on the delivery requirements. Betty, this is critical freight. 6 different hospitals have patients waiting for these medications. The delivery window is tight. You need to be at Med Logistics in Nashville by Friday morning, no later than 8 a.m. The route would take me east across California, through Arizona and New Mexico, then northeast through Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and finally into Tennessee. approximately 2,100 miles that I could cover comfortably in 4 days, while maintaining full compliance with hours of service regulations. I'd run similar routes hundreds of times, and the timing was manageable with careful planning. The delivery address was Med Logistics Distribution Center on Industrial Boulevard in Nashville, a facility I'd delivered to at least 20 times over the past 5 years. They handled pharmaceutical distribution for most of the Southeast, and I knew their procedures, their dock workers, and their security protocols. It should have been as routine as any delivery I'd ever made. I departed San Jose on Monday morning, making excellent time across California and into Arizona. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, dry roads, and light traffic that allowed me to maintain a steady 65 mph through the desert. My Kenworth was running flawlessly. The refrigeration unit was maintaining proper temperature, and all my monitoring systems showed green across the board. By Tuesday evening, I was approaching the Texas border near El Paso, ahead of schedule and feeling confident about making my Friday morning delivery appointment. I stopped for fuel and my mandatory rest break at a Flying J truck stop, where I caught up with other drivers and checked my route planning for the next day. Wednesday took me across Texas on Interstate 20, through Dallas-Fort Worth and on toward Louisiana. The landscape gradually changed from desert to farmland as I moved east, and I made good time despite increasing traffic around the metropolitan areas. I spent Wednesday night at a truck stop in Marshall, Texas, planning to cross Louisiana and Arkansas on Thursday before making the final push into Tennessee. That's when things started getting strange. Thursday morning, I was rolling east on Interstate 20 through Louisiana when my GPS system announced a route change. Recalculating route due to road closure ahead. Follow highlighted path for optimal routing. The new route directed me north on a state highway that would take me through rural Louisiana and Arkansas before connecting back to the interstate system. According to the GPS, this routing would save approximately 30 minutes and avoid construction delays that could jeopardize my delivery schedule. I'd learned to trust my GPS system over the years. It had steered me around countless traffic jams and construction zones, saving hours of delay and helping me maintain on-time delivery performance. The system was updated regularly with real-time traffic data and road conditions, so I followed its guidance and took the northern route. The state highway led me through small towns and rural areas that I'd never seen before, despite running freight through Louisiana for 3 decades. The landscape was beautiful. Moss-draped cypress trees, small farms, and historic buildings that spoke to the region's rich cultural heritage. But something about the area felt oddly isolated, as if I'd driven back in time to an earlier era. Around 2 p.m., the GPS directed me to stop for fuel at a truck stop called Magnolia Travel Plaza in a small town called Millerville, Louisiana. I'd never heard of either the town or the truck stop, but my fuel gauge was showing half full, and it's always wise to top off when hauling high-value freight through unfamiliar territory. The truck stop appeared to be a classic independent operation, the kind of family-owned business that had served truckers for decades before the major chains dominated the industry. The facility was clean and well-maintained, with reasonable fuel prices and all the amenities a professional driver needed: showers, laundry, restaurant, and a small convenience store. What caught my attention immediately was how busy the place was for a mid-afternoon on a Thursday. The parking lot was nearly full, with maybe 30 trucks of various ages and configurations scattered around the property. Most truck stops experience heavy traffic during evening hours when drivers are looking for parking spots to complete their mandatory rest periods. But this level of activity during the afternoon was unusual. I pulled up to a fuel island and began the routine of fueling my truck and checking the refrigeration unit. The fuel pumps were older but functional, and the diesel was clean and properly filtered. As I was completing the fueling process, I noticed something else unusual about the truck stop: the other drivers. Every trucker I could see appeared to be over 50 years old, and their equipment looked like it belonged to an earlier era of trucking. The trucks were mostly from the 1990s and early 2000s. Classic long hood Peterbilts, Kenworths, and Freightliners with chrome bumpers, twin exhaust stacks, and custom paint jobs that reflected the individual personalities of their owners. There's nothing wrong with older equipment, of course. Many owner-operators run trucks that are 10 or 15 years old because they're reliable, paid for, and represent the golden age of trucking when manufacturers built machines that were designed to last. But to see so many vintage trucks in one location was unusual, especially since most modern freight requires newer equipment to meet emissions standards and insurance requirements. I decided to go inside and grab some coffee while my truck was fueling. The restaurant was decorated in classic truck stop style, checkered tablecloths, trucking memorabilia on the walls, and the kind of hearty menu that had fed generations of professional drivers. The atmosphere was friendly and welcoming, with the low hum of conversation from drivers sharing stories and information about routes and road conditions. But as I listened to the conversations around me, I noticed something peculiar. The drivers were discussing fuel prices, freight rates, and road conditions that seemed to be several years out of date. They talked about diesel costing under $2 per gallon, shipping rates that were significantly lower than current market conditions, and construction projects that I remembered being completed years earlier. I approached a table where 3 older drivers were sharing coffee and conversation. They looked like career truckers, weathered faces, calloused hands, and the confident bearing that comes from decades of professional experience. "Afternoon, gentlemen," I said. "Mind if I ask how you're finding the freight market these days?" The eldest of the 3, a man who appeared to be in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes, smiled and gestured to an empty chair. "Please join us. Always good to meet another professional driver. Name's Walter Morrison. Been running these routes for 43 years. "Betty Kowalski," I replied, settling into the chair. 31 years for me. What kind of freight are you gentlemen running?" "General merchandise mostly," Walter said. "Auto parts from Detroit to distribution centers down south. Same routes I've been running for decades. Pays not what it used to be, but it's honest work." His companion, a heavy-set man with a gray beard, introduced himself as Eugene Hartley. "Refrigerated produce for me. Vegetables from California to markets in the southeast. Been doing it so long I could drive the route in my sleep." The third driver, Harold Thompson, nodded agreement. "Flatbed freight, steel, lumber, construction materials. Started driving when you still had to double clutch every shift, and weigh stations actually weighed trucks with scale masters who knew their business." These were clearly experienced professionals who understood trucking from an era when the industry operated differently. But as our conversation continued, I noticed more details that seemed inconsistent with current conditions. They talked about regulations and procedures that had been changed or eliminated years ago, discussed truck stops and shippers that had closed or been acquired by larger companies, and referenced industry practices that belonged to an earlier generation. "What year did you say you started driving, Harold?" I asked. 1978, he replied proudly. Learned on a 1976 Kenworth W900 with a Caterpillar 3406 and a 13-speed transmission. Real truck driving, not like these computerized machines they make today. "That's impressive. You must have seen incredible changes in the industry over the years." Harold's expression grew somewhat wistful. "Too many changes, and not all of them for the better. Used to be that trucking was a profession that commanded respect. Drivers were skilled craftsmen who understood their equipment and took pride in their work. Now it's all about electronic monitoring and corporate efficiency." Eugene nodded agreement. "Remember when truck stops were real communities? Places where drivers could share information, help each other out, and maintain the friendships that made this job bearable? Now everything's corporate-owned and sanitized." Walter leaned forward with the intensity of someone sharing deeply held beliefs. "The worst part is how they've taken the soul out of trucking. Used to be about the relationship between a driver and his rig. the satisfaction of moving important freight safely and efficiently. Now it's just about maximizing profits and minimizing costs. Their perspectives reflected the experiences of drivers who'd worked during trucking's golden age when the industry operated under different economic and regulatory conditions. But something about their conversation felt strange, as if they were discussing the current state of trucking from the perspective of an earlier era. "What do you think about electronic logging devices?" I asked, referring to the mandatory equipment that had revolutionized driver monitoring and hours of service compliance. All three men looked confused. "Electronic what?" Walter asked. "ELDs, electronic logging devices. They've been mandatory for commercial vehicles since 2017. The confusion on their faces was genuine. These were experienced drivers who should have been intimately familiar with one of the most significant regulatory changes in trucking history, yet they seemed to have no knowledge of electronic logging requirements. "We still use paper logbooks," Eugene said. "Always have, always will. Nothing wrong with the old way of doing things." That was impossible. Paper logbooks had been essentially eliminated by federal mandate, and any commercial driver operating in 2024 would be required to use electronic monitoring systems. The fact that these three professionals seemed unaware of ELDs suggested they'd been out of the industry for several years. "When did you gentlemen last take a load?" I asked. "Yesterday," Harold replied. "Delivered a load of lumber to a construction site outside Shreveport, picking up steel coil tomorrow for a run to Alabama." "What about DOT inspections? Have you had any problems with compliance?" Walter shrugged. "No problems. We maintain our equipment properly and follow all the regulations. Been doing this long enough to know what's expected." Their answers were increasingly puzzling. If they were actively hauling freight, they would have encountered the regulatory and technological changes that had transformed trucking over the past decade. Yet they seemed to be operating under conditions that no longer existed. I decided to test their knowledge of current industry conditions. "What are diesel prices running these days?" "About $1.90 per gallon, Eugene said. "Little high for my liking, but manageable." Diesel hadn't cost under $2 per gallon for over 15 years. Current prices were approaching $4 per gallon in many markets, a reality that every active driver would be acutely aware of since fuel costs represented a major portion of operating expenses. "How about freight rates? What are you getting per mile for general freight?" "Around $1.20 per mile," Walter replied. "Not great, but steady work." Current freight rates were significantly higher, driven by driver shortages, increased regulations, and economic factors that had transformed the industry's pricing structure. Any driver actively working would know the current rate environment. I was beginning to suspect that these three men hadn't been active drivers for several years, despite their claims about recent loads and current operations. Perhaps they were retirees who gathered at truck stops to share memories and maintain connections to their former profession. "Gentlemen, I don't mean to be intrusive, but when exactly did you retire from driving?" All three men looked at me with expressions of confusion and mild offense. "Retire?" Walter said. "We're still working. Been on the road our whole adult lives, and we'll keep driving until we can't pass the physical anymore." "But the regulations and conditions you're describing haven't existed for years. Electronic logs have been mandatory since 2017. Diesel prices haven't been under $2 since the early 2000s. Freight rates have increased significantly due to industry changes." Harold leaned back in his chair with a patronizing smile. "Young lady, I appreciate your concern, but I think you might be confused about current market conditions. We've been driving these routes for decades, and we know exactly what's happening in the industry." The conversation was becoming uncomfortable, but I couldn't let go of the inconsistencies I was observing. These were clearly experienced truckers who understood the profession, but their knowledge seemed to be frozen in an earlier time period. "What's today's date?" I asked. "March 14th, 2006, Eugene replied without hesitation. My blood went cold. Today was March 14th, 2024. These three drivers seemed to believe they were living 18 years in the past. Gentlemen, I need to tell you something. Today is March 14th, 2024. It's been 18 years since 2006. Walter laughed kindly. Betty, I think you might be more tired than you realize. Long hauls can play tricks on your mind sometimes. Maybe you should get some rest before you continue your trip. But I was certain about the date. My electronic logging device, my cell phone, and my GPS system all confirmed that today was March 14th, 2024. Either these three men were experiencing some kind of mass delusion, or something very strange was happening at this truck stop. I excused myself from the table and walked outside to check my truck and collect my thoughts. The fueling was complete, and my refrigeration unit was maintaining proper temperature for the pharmaceutical cargo. All my systems showed normal operation, and my GPS indicated that I should continue northeast toward Arkansas to stay on schedule for my Friday morning delivery. But as I prepared to leave, I noticed something else unusual about the truck stop. Despite the heavy traffic and full parking lot, I hadn't seen a single truck arrive or depart during the entire time I'd been there. All the vehicles appeared to be permanently parked, as if they'd been there for hours or days without movement. I walked around the parking lot, examining the trucks more closely. They were all clean and well-maintained, but many showed signs of being stationary for extended periods. Dust on the windshields, flat spots on the tires, and the settled appearance of vehicles that hadn't moved recently. More disturbing was the absence of any modern equipment. Every truck in the lot appeared to be from the 1990s or early 2000s, with no examples of the newer models that dominated current fleets. It was like stepping into a museum of trucking history rather than an active commercial facility. I tried to start a conversation with other drivers in the parking lot, hoping to get some clarity about what I was experiencing. But every interaction followed the same pattern. Experienced professionals who demonstrated extensive knowledge of trucking, but seemed to be operating in a different time period. A driver named Dorothy, who was checking the securement on her flatbed load, told me she was hauling steel beams to a construction project in Arkansas. When I asked about electronic logging compliance, she looked confused and mentioned that she maintained detailed paper records as required by regulations. Another driver, Frank, was performing a pre-trip inspection on his refrigerated trailer. He spoke knowledgeably about temperature control and cargo protection, but referenced equipment and procedures that were no longer current. When I mentioned GPS tracking systems, he seemed puzzled and said he navigated using paper maps and road knowledge accumulated over decades of experience. Every conversation reinforced the same pattern: competent professionals who understood trucking but seemed to exist in an earlier era of the industry. They were all friendly, knowledgeable, and helpful, but their reality didn't align with the current state of commercial transportation. I returned to my truck, increasingly unsettled by what I was experiencing. The logical explanation was that I'd stumbled into some kind of themed truck stop or historical attraction where retirees gathered to share memories of their driving careers. But the facility appeared to be a functioning commercial operation, and the drivers seemed genuinely convinced they were actively working. As I prepared to leave, Walter Morrison approached my truck. "Betty, before you head out, I wanted to give you some advice about the route ahead. There's been some weather moving through Arkansas, and road conditions might be challenging." "What kind of weather?" "Ice storm that came through last night. Authorities are recommending that commercial vehicles avoid the interstate until conditions improve. Might want to consider laying over here until morning." I checked my weather apps and GPS system, both of which showed clear conditions throughout Arkansas and Tennessee. There were no weather advisories, no reports of ice storms, and no recommendations to avoid interstate travel. "Walter, my weather information shows clear conditions ahead. No storms or advisories reported." He shook his head with the confidence of someone who'd been monitoring weather conditions for decades. "Don't trust those electronic gadgets, young lady.
I've been talking to other drivers on the CB, and they're all reporting hazardous conditions. Better to be safe than sorry with valuable freight. The CB radio was another inconsistency I'd noticed. Many of the drivers at the truck stop were using CB equipment, but I hadn't heard any chatter on Channel 19 or any other frequencies during my time there. The radio spectrum seemed completely quiet, which was unusual for an area with heavy truck traffic. I thanked Walter for his concern, but explained that I needed to maintain my delivery schedule. As I prepared to leave the truck stop, I made one final attempt to understand what I was experiencing. "Walter, can you tell me what company you're running for?" "Independent owner-operator," he replied proudly. "Been running under my own authority for 22 years. Sunset Transport Services, though most folks just call me Old Walter." I made a mental note to research Sunset Transport Services when I had internet access. If Walter was still an active owner-operator, his company should have current DOT registration and safety records that I could verify. As I pulled away from Magnolia Travel Plaza, I felt a profound sense of relief to be back on the highway. The truck stop had been beautiful and the drivers were friendly, but something about the entire experience had been deeply unsettling. The inconsistencies I'd observed were too numerous and specific to be explained by simple confusion or nostalgia. I continued northeast through Louisiana, crossing into Arkansas as the afternoon wore on. The landscape was beautiful, rolling hills, forests, and small towns that embodied the character of the American South. My truck was running perfectly, and the GPS showed that I was making excellent time toward my delivery appointment in Nashville. But I couldn't stop thinking about the drivers I'd met at the truck stop. Their knowledge of trucking was extensive and authentic, but their perception of current conditions seemed to be frozen in an earlier era. The most unsettling aspect was their absolute conviction that they were actively working in an industry that had moved beyond the conditions they described. Around 6 p.m., I stopped for fuel at a modern truck stop chain in Arkansas. The facility was typical of contemporary operations: bright lighting, modern equipment, corporate standardization, and all the conveniences that current drivers expected. The contrast with Magnolia Travel Plaza was striking. While my truck was fueling, I used my smartphone to research Sunset Transport Services. The search results were troubling. The company had been dissolved in 2006 following the death of its owner-operator, Walter Morrison, in a single-vehicle accident on a Louisiana state highway. According to the accident report, Walter had been driving through a severe ice storm when he lost control of his truck and crashed into a bridge abutment. He was 68 years old at the time of his death and had been driving professionally for over 40 years. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arkansas evening air. The Walter Morrison I'd met at Magnolia Travel Plaza matched the description of the deceased driver perfectly. Age, appearance, and the proud independence of a career owner-operator. I searched for information about Eugene Hartley and Harold Thompson, the other two drivers I'd talked with. Both searches yielded similar results. Eugene had died in 2007 when his refrigerated truck jackknifed during a blizzard in Oklahoma. Harold had been killed in 2005 when his flatbed load shifted during an emergency maneuver, causing his truck to roll over. All three men had died within a few years of each other, all in weather-related accidents, all while operating the types of trucks and hauling the kinds of freight they'd described to me. If the records were accurate, I'd spent an afternoon talking with drivers who had been dead for nearly 20 years. The logical explanation was that I'd confused the names, or that there were other drivers with similar identities who were still active. Professional trucking was a large industry, and name coincidences were certainly possible. But the specific details of our conversations, their equipment, their routes, their company names, matched the deceased drivers too closely to be coincidental. I tried to find information about Magnolia Travel Plaza in Millerville, Louisiana. No search results returned any current listings for either the truck stop or the town.
Historical records showed that Millerville had been a small community that was largely abandoned after a major highway realignment project in the 1990s redirected traffic away from the area. According to the historical information, there had been a truck stop called Magnolia Travel Plaza that served the old highway route until it closed in 2006 due to lack of traffic following the realignment. The facility had been demolished several years later as part of an environmental cleanup project. If the historical records were accurate, the truck stop where I'd spent the afternoon no longer existed and hadn't operated commercially for nearly 20 years. Either I'd somehow visited a location that didn't exist, or I was experiencing some kind of breakdown in my perception of reality. I sat in my truck at the Arkansas fuel stop, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The most rational explanation was that I'd become confused about locations and confused my memories of different truck stops from over the years. Long-haul driving involved visiting hundreds of similar facilities, and it was certainly possible to mix up details and conversations. But the specificity of what I'd experienced made simple confusion unlikely. I remembered clear details about the truck stop's layout, the appearance of the other drivers, and the content of our conversations. The experience had been too vivid and detailed to be a confusion of memories. Another possibility was that I was experiencing some kind of medical emergency, a stroke, seizure, or other condition that could affect perception and memory. I performed a basic self-assessment, checking my coordination, speech, and cognitive function. Everything seemed normal, and I felt completely alert and capable of continuing my trip. The most disturbing possibility was that I'd somehow encountered something that existed outside normal reality, a place where deceased drivers continued their routines and maintained their connections to the trucking life they'd known. The idea seemed impossible, but it was the only explanation that accounted for all the details I'd observed. I decided to continue toward Nashville and complete my delivery as scheduled. Whatever I'd experienced at Magnolia Travel Plaza, it hadn't affected my ability to operate my truck safely or complete my responsibilities to the customers who were depending on the medications I was carrying. But as I rolled through the Arkansas night, I couldn't shake the memory of Walter Morrison's kind smile and his genuine concern for my safety on the road ahead. If he was really a driver who died 18 years ago, his continued vigilance over fellow truckers was both touching and terrifying. The highway stretched ahead through the darkness, illuminated by my headlights and the occasional glow of small towns and truck stops. I maintained my usual pace and monitoring procedures, but I found myself paying closer attention to the CB radio, listening for voices that might belong to drivers who were traveling roads that existed in a different dimension of time and space. Around midnight, as I was crossing into Tennessee, my CB crackled with a transmission that made my blood run cold. Eastbound truck approaching the Tennessee line. This is Old Walter monitoring Channel 19. You've got some weather moving in ahead of you. Ice storm building around Nashville. Might want to consider finding a safe place to park until conditions improve. I grabbed my microphone with shaking hands. Old Walter, this is the Red Kenworth you talked to this afternoon. Are you monitoring current weather conditions? Affirmative, Red Kenworth. Been watching the weather reports, and it's not looking good ahead of you. The storm's been building all evening, and road conditions are deteriorating rapidly. I checked my weather apps and GPS system again. Both showed clear conditions throughout Tennessee, with no storms or advisories reported. But Walter's voice was clear and concerned, carrying the authority of a driver who'd spent decades monitoring weather patterns and road conditions. Walter, my weather information shows clear conditions. No advisories or warnings. Don't trust those electronic gadgets, Betty. Trust the voice of experience. I've been through too many storms to ignore the warning signs. Find a safe place to park and wait for daylight. The use of my name confirmed that this was the same Walter Morrison I'd met at the truck stop. But if my research was accurate, Walter had been dead for 18 years. Either I was experiencing some kind of ongoing hallucination,
or I was receiving safety warnings from a driver who was broadcasting from beyond the grave. "Walter, where are you located?" "Southbound on Highway 61, about 50 miles west of you. Been monitoring traffic reports and talking to other drivers about conditions ahead." Highway 61 was a north-south route that wouldn't intersect with my eastbound travel on Interstate 40. If Walter was really monitoring traffic conditions, he would have to be getting information from other sources rather than direct observation. As I continued east toward Nashville, I started encountering exactly the weather conditions that Walter had warned about. The temperature dropped rapidly, and a light drizzle began that quickly turned to freezing rain. Within 30 minutes, I was driving through an ice storm that made the highway increasingly treacherous. I reduced my speed and increased my following distance, using the techniques that 3 decades of experience had taught me for handling hazardous conditions. But the storm was severe enough to make continued travel dangerous, especially with valuable pharmaceutical cargo that couldn't be risked in an accident. I found a truck stop outside Nashville and pulled in to wait for the storm to pass. As I was parking my truck, the CB crackled again with Walter's voice. "Red Kenworth, this is old Walter. Glad to see you found a safe place to park. Storm should clear by morning and you'll be able to complete your delivery safely." "Walter, how did you know I was parking?" "Been monitoring your progress and the weather conditions. Just want to make sure fellow drivers stay safe out here." The idea that a deceased driver was somehow monitoring my progress and providing safety guidance was both comforting and terrifying. If Walter was really looking out for me, his ghostly presence represented the kind of professional solidarity that had always characterized the trucking community. I spent the night at the truck stop, watching ice accumulate on my windshield while other drivers dealt with the same hazardous conditions that Walter had warned about. By morning, the storm had passed, and road conditions had improved enough to allow safe travel. I completed my delivery to Med Logistics in Nashville without incident, arriving exactly on schedule despite the weather delay. The pharmaceutical cargo was accepted and immediately distributed to hospitals throughout the Southeast, where it would help save lives and improve patient outcomes. But as I prepared to deadhead back to California for my next load, I couldn't stop thinking about my encounter with Walter Morrison and the other drivers at Magnolia Travel Plaza. Whether they were real ghosts, hallucinations, or something else entirely, they represented a connection to trucking's past that was both beautiful and haunting. Over the following weeks, I researched the phenomenon of ghost truck stops and deceased drivers who were reported to still be active on the highways. I found dozens of similar stories from drivers across the country, encounters with truckers who seemed to exist in earlier eras, warnings from deceased drivers about road hazards, and truck stops that appeared to operate normally but didn't exist in current reality. Some drivers attributed these experiences to fatigue, stress, or the psychological effects of spending long hours alone on isolated highways. Others believed they represented genuine encounters with spirits who remained connected to the trucking life they'd known. For me, the experience changed how I approached my career and my relationship with the trucking community. I began to see myself as part of a continuum that stretched back through generations of professional drivers who had dedicated their lives to moving America's freight safely and efficiently. I also developed a deeper appreciation for the older drivers who had built the traditions and standards that defined professional trucking. Whether Walter Morrison was a ghost, a hallucination, or something else, his concern for my safety represented the values that had always made trucking more than just a job. The highway remains a place of mystery and wonder, where the boundaries between past and present sometimes blur. Somewhere out there, Walter Morrison and countless other drivers continue their eternal watch over the roads they knew so well, offering guidance and protection to the living drivers who follow in their tire tracks. And sometimes, if you're listening carefully to Channel 19 on a dark night when the weather is turning bad, you might hear old Walter's voice offering the kind of road wisdom that only comes from drivers who understood that trucking was about more than moving freight. It was about taking care of each other on the long journey home. Safe travels, driver. Keep your eyes on the road, your hands on the wheel, and your ears tuned to the voices of experience that echo across the highways of America. Because in trucking, no one drives alone, and the best drivers never really retire. They just find different ways to keep watch over the road they loved. But my story with the ghost drivers of Magnolia Travel Plaza was far from over. 3 months later, in June 2024, I found myself running another high-value pharmaceutical load from Los Angeles to Atlanta, taking a route that would once again pass through Louisiana. Despite my earlier experience, or perhaps because of it, I felt drawn to investigate whether the mysterious truck stop still existed and whether Walter Morrison and his fellow drivers were still there. This time, I was hauling a load of experimental cancer treatments worth over $4.2 million, bound for research hospitals throughout the Southeast. The freight required even more stringent security protocols than my previous load, including satellite tracking, armed escort coordination, and direct communication with federal law enforcement agencies monitoring high-value medical shipments. The load had originated from Prometheus Pharmaceuticals in Los Angeles, a cutting-edge biotechnology company that specialized in developing breakthrough treatments for terminal illnesses. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the company's logistics director, had personally briefed me on the critical nature of the shipment. "Betty, these medications represent years of research and clinical trials. There are cancer patients in Atlanta, Birmingham, and New Orleans whose lives depend on receiving these treatments within the next 72 hours. We've chosen you because of your impeccable safety record and reputation for handling sensitive cargo." The delivery schedule was extremely tight. I had to reach Emory University Hospital in Atlanta by Thursday morning, then continue to UAB Hospital in Birmingham, and finally to Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans. 3 critical deliveries across 3 states, with no margin for error or delay. I departed Los Angeles on Monday evening, planning to drive through the night to make maximum use of my available hours while avoiding the intense heat and traffic of daytime travel through the Southwest deserts. My Kenworth was running perfectly, and I'd spent the afternoon before departure performing a comprehensive pre-trip inspection and maintenance check. The route would take me east across California, through Arizona and New Mexico, then southeast through Texas and Louisiana before turning northeast toward Georgia. Approximately 2,400 miles that I could cover in 5 days while maintaining full compliance with hours of service regulations and security protocols. Tuesday took me across the Mojave Desert and through Arizona, where I stopped for fuel and my mandatory rest break in Flagstaff. The mountain air was crisp and clean, providing a refreshing contrast to the smog and congestion of Los Angeles. My refrigeration unit was maintaining perfect temperature control, and all monitoring systems showed optimal performance. Wednesday brought me through New Mexico and into Texas, where I made excellent time across the vast expanses of desert and ranch land. The landscape was stark but beautiful, with endless horizons that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with long-haul trucking 3 decades earlier. I spent Wednesday night at a truck stop in Beaumont, Texas, planning to cross Louisiana on Thursday morning. Thursday morning, as I was preparing to enter Louisiana, I made a deliberate decision to take the same route that had led me to Magnolia Travel Plaza 3 months earlier. I told myself it was because the routing had been efficient and had helped me avoid traffic delays, but the truth was that I needed to know whether my earlier experience had been real or imagined. I programmed my GPS to follow the same state highway through rural Louisiana, telling myself that I was simply conducting an experiment in route efficiency. If the truck stop didn't exist, I would know that my previous experience had been some kind of hallucination or stress-induced episode. If it did exist but operated as a normal commercial facility, I could put my concerns to rest and focus on my delivery schedule. But if I encountered the same anachronistic conditions and ghostly drivers, I would have to accept that I'd stumbled into something that existed outside normal reality. The state highway led me through the same beautiful countryside I remembered from my previous trip. Moss-draped cypress trees, small farms, and historic buildings that spoke to Louisiana's rich cultural heritage. The landscape felt familiar, yet somehow dreamlike, as if I was driving through a memory rather than current reality. Around 11 a.m., I reached the location where Magnolia Travel Plaza should have been. What I found there made my hands shake on the steering wheel and my heart pound in my chest. The truck stop was exactly as I remembered it. Clean, well-maintained, busy with traffic from dozens of vintage trucks. The fuel islands were operational, the restaurant was open, and drivers were moving around the property with the purposeful efficiency of professionals conducting their business. But now I knew that, according to historical records, this facility had been demolished nearly 20 years ago. Either the historical records were wrong, or I was once again experiencing something that shouldn't exist. I pulled into the same fuel island I'd used during my previous visit, fighting a mixture of fear and fascination. Part of me wanted to flee immediately and find an alternate route to Atlanta, but a larger part needed to understand what was happening and why I seemed to be able to access this phantom truck stop. As I began fueling my truck, I noticed that the other drivers and their equipment were identical to what I'd observed 3 months earlier. Walter Morrison was there with his classic Kenworth, Eugene Hartley was checking his refrigerated trailer, and Harold Thompson was securing his flatbed load. It was as if time had been frozen at Magnolia Travel Plaza, preserving a perfect moment from trucking's golden age. Walter approached my truck with the same kind smile and professional demeanor I remembered from our previous encounter. "Good morning, Betty. Good to see you back on this route. How's the freight business treating you?" "Hello, Walter. I'm surprised to see you here. Thought you might have moved on to different routes by now." He chuckled with genuine warmth. "Been running these same routes for over 40 years. Don't see any reason to change now. What brings you through our neck of the woods again?" I explained that I was hauling medical freight to Atlanta, Birmingham, and New Orleans, mentioning the critical nature of the cargo and the tight delivery schedule. Walter listened with the attentive interest of a professional who understood the responsibilities of handling important freight. "Medical supplies, eh? That's important work. People's lives depend on drivers like you getting their cargo delivered safely and on time. You be extra careful with that load, especially through the construction zones around Baton Rouge." I checked my GPS and traffic apps, both of which showed clear conditions around Baton Rouge with no construction delays reported. But I'd learned from my previous visit that Walter and his fellow drivers operated with information from a different time period. "Walter, can I ask you something? What year do you think it is?" He looked at me with mild confusion. "June 15th, 2006, of course." "Why do you ask?" The same temporal displacement I'd encountered during my previous visit. Walter and the other drivers seemed to be trapped in 2006, unaware that nearly 20 years had passed since then. "Walter, I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear. Today is June 15th, 2024. It's been 18 years since 2006. His expression shifted to one of kind concern. "Betty, I think you might be more tired than you realize. Long hauls can affect your perception sometimes. Maybe you should rest here for a while before continuing your trip." I decided to try a different approach. "Walter, can you tell me about your family? Do you have anyone waiting for you at home?" His face lit up with pride and affection. "My wife Margaret and I have been married for 46 years. Got 2 sons who are both in the trucking business, and 4 grandchildren who think their grandpa hung the moon. Margaret worries about me being on the road so much, but she understands that this is what I do." The warmth and specificity of his response suggested that Walter's family relationships were real and important to him, even if his perception of time was frozen in the past. I wondered whether his wife and children knew about his continued presence at this phantom truck stop, or whether they had mourned his death and moved on with their lives. "Do you get to see them often?" "Every couple of weeks when I'm in the area. Margaret always has a home-cooked meal waiting, and the grandkids love hearing stories about life on the road. They're too young to understand the business yet, but maybe someday they'll follow in the family tradition. Walter's description of his family life was detailed and heartfelt. But if my research was accurate, his wife had likely died years ago, and his children and grandchildren were now middle-aged adults who had their own families and careers. The Walter Morrison I was talking to seemed to exist in a bubble of time that preserved his life as it had been in 2006. I spent another hour at Magnolia Travel Plaza, talking with Walter, Eugene, and Harold about their routes, their equipment, and their perspectives on the trucking industry. Their knowledge remained extensive, and their personalities unchanged from my previous visit. But I now understood that I was interacting with drivers who were somehow trapped in a moment from the past. The experience was both comforting and deeply sad. These were good men who had dedicated their lives to professional trucking, and their continued presence at this phantom truck stop suggested that their connection to the road had been so strong that death hadn't been able to sever it completely. But I also recognized that my ability to interact with them carried some kind of responsibility. If I was one of the few people who could see and communicate with these ghostly drivers, perhaps I was meant to help them in some way. "Walter," I said as I prepared to leave, "is there anything you need? Anything I can do to help you?" He smiled with the contentment of a man who was exactly where he belonged. "Just keep doing what you're doing, Betty. Moving important freight safely and professionally. Taking care of your equipment and looking out for fellow drivers. That's all any of us can ask for." As I pulled away from Magnolia Travel Plaza for the second time, I felt a mixture of wonder and melancholy. These drivers had found a way to continue the work they loved even after death, but they were also trapped in a version of reality that no longer existed. I continued northeast toward Atlanta, my mind churning with questions about what I'd experienced and what it meant. The pharmaceutical cargo in my trailer was critically important to cancer patients who were fighting for their lives, and I needed to focus on completing my deliveries safely and on time. But I couldn't stop thinking about Walter Morrison and his fellow drivers, eternally working routes that existed in a parallel dimension where trucking's golden age had never ended. My delivery to Emory University Hospital in Atlanta went smoothly, with the medical staff expressing profound gratitude for the experimental treatments that could save lives and offer hope to terminal patients. The cargo was transferred to secure storage immediately, where it would be prepared for clinical trials that could revolutionize cancer treatment. From Atlanta, I continued to Birmingham for my second delivery at UAB Hospital. The medical team there was equally appreciative, explaining that the treatments I'd delivered would be used in groundbreaking research that could benefit cancer patients worldwide. My final delivery in New Orleans at Tulane Medical Center completed the shipment successfully, with all cargo delivered on time and in perfect condition. The 3-day journey had been professionally satisfying, knowing that my work was directly contributing to medical advances that could save lives. But as I prepared to deadhead back to Los Angeles for my next load, I made another decision to return to Magnolia Travel Plaza. I needed to understand more about what was happening there and whether there was anything I could do to help Walter and his fellow drivers find peace. This time, when I arrived at the truck stop, I was greeted by a new driver I hadn't met before. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the confident bearing of an experienced professional. "You must be Betty," she said, approaching my truck with a warm smile. "Walter told me about you. I'm Dorothy Henderson. Been driving for 38 years. Most folks call me Highway Dorothy." "Nice to meet you, Dorothy. What kind of freight do you run?" "Household goods, mostly. Help families move from one part of the country to another. Not glamorous work, but it's honest and it serves a real need. People depend on drivers like us to transport their most precious possessions safely." Dorothy's knowledge of trucking was as extensive as the male drivers I'd met, and she spoke with the authority of someone who had succeeded in a profession that was still predominantly male. But like Walter and the others, her perception of current conditions seemed to be frozen in the past. "Dorothy, when did you start driving professionally?" "1988. Learned on my husband's truck after he was killed in an accident. Had to support my 3 children, and trucking was the only skill I had that could provide a decent living." Her story was heartbreaking but inspiring. A widowed mother who had entered a challenging profession to support her family. The determination and courage required for such a transition spoke to the strength of character that had defined many women in trucking. "How did your children handle you being on the road so much?" "It was difficult, especially when they were young. But they understood that I was working to provide for them and give them opportunities I'd never had. All 3 graduated from college, and they've got good careers now. They're proud of their mother, even if they worried about me on the road." Like Walter's description of his family, Dorothy's account was detailed and emotionally authentic. But if she was deceased, like the other drivers at Magnolia Travel Plaza, her children were now adults who had built their own lives after mourning their mother's death. "Dorothy, what's the most rewarding aspect of trucking for you?" "The independence and the variety. Every load is different, every route offers new scenery, and you meet interesting people along the way. But most of all, it's the satisfaction of completing important work professionally. People trust you with their possessions, their livelihoods, their dreams. That's a responsibility I've never taken lightly." Her perspective on trucking reflected the values that had always defined the best professional drivers: responsibility, integrity, and pride in honest work. These were timeless qualities that transcended changes in technology, regulations, or industry structure. I spent several hours at Magnolia Travel Plaza, talking with Dorothy and the other drivers about their experiences, their families, and their perspectives on trucking. The conversations were rich and meaningful, offering insights into the human side of an industry that was often reduced to statistics and economics. But I was also troubled by the realization that these drivers seemed to be trapped in a loop that prevented them from moving on to whatever came after death. Their continued presence at the truck stop suggested that they had unfinished business or unresolved attachments that kept them bound to their earthly existence. "Walter," I said during a quiet moment, "do you ever think about what comes next? About life after trucking?" He considered the question seriously. "I suppose I'll retire eventually, when I can't pass the physical anymore. Spend more time with Margaret and the grandkids. Maybe do some fishing. But I can't imagine not being connected to trucking somehow. It's been my whole adult life." "What if I told you that Margaret and your family are waiting for you somewhere else? That they're ready for you to join them?" Walter's expression became wistful. "I'd like to believe that's true. But right now I feel like I have work to finish here. Routes to run, freight to deliver, fellow drivers to look out for. Maybe when that work is done, I'll be ready to move on." His response suggested that Walter and the other drivers were aware on some level that their current existence was temporary, but they weren't ready to let go of the lives they'd known. The truck stop served as a kind of purgatory where they could continue the work they loved while avoiding the final transition to whatever came next. Over the following months, I found myself returning to Magnolia Travel Plaza whenever my routes took me through Louisiana. Each visit revealed new details about the drivers who gathered there and the phantom existence they maintained. I learned that the truck stop existed in a kind of temporal bubble where the drivers experienced a perpetual loop of the same period from 2006. They had no awareness of the passage of time or the changes that had occurred in the outside world since their deaths. The drivers who gathered there had all died in weather-related accidents during a particularly severe winter in the mid-2000s. Walter Morrison, Eugene Hartley, Harold Thompson, Dorothy Henderson, and several others had all perished within a few months of each other, victims of the hazardous conditions that made trucking one of America's most dangerous professions. But their love for trucking and their commitment to the profession
had somehow prevented them from accepting death and moving on to whatever lay beyond. They remained trapped in a version of reality where they could continue the work they'd known, but cut off from the natural progression of time and life. I began to understand that my role was not just to observe this phenomenon, but to help these drivers find the peace that had eluded them since their deaths. They needed to accept that their earthly work was finished, and that it was time to reunite with the families who were waiting for them. The breakthrough came during my 6th visit to Magnolia Travel Plaza in December 2024. I arrived to find Walter sitting alone in the restaurant, staring out the window at his truck with an expression of profound sadness. "Walter, what's wrong?" He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Betty, I've been thinking about what you said about Margaret and the family waiting for me. I've been having dreams lately, dreams where I can see them but I can't reach them. Margaret looks older, and the grandkids are grown up with children of their own. Walter, those aren't dreams. They're memories of how things really are. Your family has aged and changed since you died, but they're still waiting for you." "I know," he said quietly. "I think I've known for a while now, but I was afraid to admit it because it would mean letting go of everything I've been. What you've been doesn't have to end. The love you have for trucking, for your family, for helping other drivers, that's eternal. But you don't have to stay trapped here to preserve it." Walter nodded slowly. "I've been holding on to this life because I wasn't ready to say goodbye. But staying here isn't really living, is it? It's just avoiding death. Your family loves you too much to want you trapped in this limbo. They want you to find peace and join them where they are." Over the next hour, I had similar conversations with Eugene, Harold, Dorothy, and the other drivers at Magnolia Travel Plaza. Each one had begun to sense that their current existence was artificial, and that they needed to let go of their earthly attachments to find true peace. The process of helping them accept their deaths and prepare for transition was emotionally exhausting but deeply meaningful. These were good people who had lived honorable lives and deserved to find rest after their long years of service to the trucking industry. As the sun set on that December evening, the drivers of Magnolia Travel Plaza began to say their goodbyes. They thanked me for helping them understand their situation and for giving them the courage to move on to whatever came next. Walter was the last to leave. He walked around his beloved Kenworth one final time, running his hands over the chrome and checking the tires with the thoroughness of a professional who had always taken pride in his equipment. "Thank you, Betty," he said, embracing me with the warmth of a father saying goodbye to a daughter. "You've given us the greatest gift possible, the chance to finally go home. Safe travels, Walter. Give my regards to Margaret and the family." He smiled with genuine joy for the first time since I'd known him. "I will. And Betty, remember what I told you about taking care of fellow drivers. That responsibility doesn't end just because we're gone." As Walter walked away from his truck toward a light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, I felt a profound sense of peace and completion. The drivers of Magnolia Travel Plaza had found the rest they deserved, and I had played a small part in helping them reach their final destination. The truck stop faded around me as the last driver disappeared into the light, leaving me alone on an empty stretch of Louisiana highway. When I checked my GPS, I found that I was parked on the shoulder of a rural road with no truck stop or any other facility in sight. But I wasn't afraid or confused. I understood that I had been privileged to help good people find peace after years of wandering in limbo. The experience had changed my understanding of life, death, and the connections that bind us to the work we love and the people we care about. I continued my journey back to Los Angeles, carrying with me the memory of Walter Morrison and his fellow drivers who had taught me that some responsibilities transcend death and that the best aspects of human nature compassion, dedication, and love are truly eternal. The highway stretched ahead through the darkness, illuminated by my headlights and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the visible horizon, good drivers had finally found their way home. And I knew that whenever I faced challenges or difficulties on the road ahead, I would remember Walter's words about taking care of fellow drivers and honoring the traditions that make trucking more than just a job. In the end, Magnolia Travel Plaza had been a way station not just for ghostly drivers seeking peace, but for a living driver learning about the deeper meanings of the profession she had chosen. The Phantom truck stop had taught me that trucking is about more than moving freight. It's about service, community, and the eternal bonds that connect all who answer the call of the open road. Safe travels, Walter. Safe travels to all the drivers who have gone before us and all who will follow. The highway continues, and so does the watch we keep over each other on the long journey that never truly ends.